आदिती
Yes, sir.
एकदा स्क्रीन शेअर करून चेक करू का?
ऍक्च्युली होतंय पण वी
काय
कॅन
गरज
जस्ट
नाही ना?
नाही करत.
ठीक आहे.
हां, आणि आय हॅव युअर पीपीटी इन केस.
हा जस्ट प्रॉब्लेम आला तर ना, मी आज
Yes,
परत
yes.
पाठवलं होतं लेटेस्ट.
हो
हा ठीक आहे.
थँक्यू.
Sorry, my internet is behaving funnily. If I go off, I'll log in through my mobile hotspot.
Okay, sir.
Just to be aware.
Yes, I'll just invite you for a few minutes talk.
You start off, please.
Yes.
It's only 49, so 11 minutes more.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We also don't have many participants, so we'll wait till
तेरा येतात.
they will join when let's see.
Yeah, it is 52 right now, so
Yeah,
another
yeah.
8 minutes. So
Yeah.
माझ्या इथे बाहेरचा खूप आवाज येतोय आहे ना?
नाही.
कारण इकडे शेजारी कामं चाललेत भरपूर, त्यामुळे.
नाही.
आणि आमच्या शेजारच्यांचा कुत्रा मी मीटिंगला बसलो की
He also wants to join.
त्याला जॉईन व्हायचं असतं मीटिंगमध्ये.
खिडकी बंद करा, खिडकी.
हो ना.
मी पण खिडकी बंद करतो.
हो, अक्षरशः
रोड ट्रॅफिक येतो.
नाही, तो इतक्या जोरात भुंकतो, शेजारी बसून भुंकल्यासारखं वाटतं, त्यामुळे खिडकी बंद करून काय होत नाही. तेव्हा एनिवे I'll tell them प्रॉब्लेम आला तर.
Yes, sir. No, it's clear as of now. It's very.
No, right now it is clear. When I start talking, you will probably. Anyway, that's fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll turn my video off, or should I keep it on?
No, either works. We will anyway highlight the speaker video as well.
Yeah. So
later.
Okay, I'll keep it off for now.
Sure. Yes.
Hello, Aditi, can you hear me?
Vijay, how are you?
I'm okay.
Great.
Yesterday very well. Eh?
Yeah.
Aditi spoke extremely well.
Oh,
Everything going good so far, sir. Namaskar.
Very impressed. Namaskar, Amita. Yesterday, didn't Aditi spoke so well.
Well, Aditi has been with me for 5 years now. We are a great team. We are a great team, sir. Thank you very much.
No, I'm saying Aditya Thackeray spoke very well.
Aditya Thackeray, of course, he was in the car actually, but he spoke extempore, whatever came to his mind.
But it was very good what came to his mind.
So what struck us that it is his commitment that although he was traveling, he made sure that he participated and commented. And the major thing about his thing, he said he wants this subject of climate change, climate action now to be politicized. So that is a very welcome statement coming from our young environment minister. And that is what we will carry forward after this. So,
Dr. Marshall, I have requested Professor Malik that we bring out a environment manifesto for
Yes.
India and also Maharashtra.
Yeah. I think we are the right people to do that.
So PIC
Amitav,
yes,
I remember before the cabinet was to be formed,
yes, sir.
actually portfolios were to be given. I remember 1st January, I had met Aditya Thackeray and of course Uddhav Thackeray and then Aditya.
Yes, sir. I remember you saying that.
Yeah, and Aditya actually said, I chose this particular portfolio. I wanted this
Correct.
portfolio.
Right.
So if somebody does that, I think that shows his.
There's a lot of enthusiasm, energy behind it.
No, we have the best environment minister.
Yes. We have to make the best of it also.
Yeah, we have to make the best of it.
We are trying our best, sir.
Yeah.
So today also we have got very good speakers. And towards the end, sir, we will request you to
Yeah, I will.
give your comments, and then I will finally say thanks.
Yeah. Vijay.
Yeah.
What I was thinking was that I will focus on the importance of technology research and innovation and how much to do, because enough of this make in India, we have to invent in India.
Yeah. Correct. Beautiful.
Because I would like to strongly emphasize that particularly Rajiv Kumar's ears are there.
Yeah.
When I speak, he should know that the R&D investments have been stuck at 0.68% for last 25 years. And we have to invest more. Particularly in this space, particularly in this
point.
Yeah. And also the different kinds of options, because we don't have time at our hand. So some of the technologies we have to buy, some of them we have to get them at different levels, technology readiness level. And some of them we have to make, and how the balance should be created and how government policies can come in a big way there.
Yeah.
That's what I like to emphasize, basically, because that's extremely important.
Vijay, so your camera can be tilted a little below, then you will come proper in focus, slightly below. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's better.
Is it okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Good.
Should I go and comb my hair?
No.
You can comb your beard though.
That one is confused to do sort of gardening.
Well, I lost all my hair about a month ago, but it's slowly growing.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
I've done Mundan for the Shraddha, no?
Yeah.
So now it's slowly growing.
Yeah.
How many people attended yesterday? With the total?
300 odd, sir.
Don't tell me. Wow.
I think this is a terrific number.
357. Today our registration has crossed 600. It is 621 today. Let us see how many join.
No, but registration itself is a good indicator, no?
Yeah, very good. No, the 600 had registered, so that's very good.
So I think PIC is catching up. People are understanding.
Yeah.
That, meaningful stuff is happening here.
Yeah,
Exactly. Thanks to you, this is getting traction.
Yeah. You saw the policy, no?
All of us.
Day before yesterday.
Yeah.
The green hydrogen policy announced by the government.
No, I not read it. I just saw the headline.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, but it's a very good one.
Okay.
Because during the recording, Mukesh made a reference to that specifically.
Okay.
And it has come out fantastic, by the way, the conversation.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes, sir. Ravi also spoke extremely well. He spoke extempore, but he spoke extremely well.
Yeah, but he nowadays leaves green energy, eats green energy for breakfast.
Yeah.
He's completely committed now.
I wonder what he's calling his wife these days. Hey, green, Gurudas.
Hello. Hi.
We missed you yesterday.
No, I was there.
He was there,
I
sir.
was there.
He was there very
Yeah.
So have you started drafting manifesto or not?
well. We start that on Monday.
Okay. Are our colleagues from BP also here? Have they joined?
Yesterday, Rajiv Kumar had joined for a while. He
Okay.
did. Yeah.
Today, what time
Vedant is also.
Rajiv will start speaking? Rajiv Kumar?
Around 7, sir.
7. Okay.
गुरुदास
Sir, it's
Yes. Hello, Vedant.
हाय नंतर फोनवरती बोलीन तुझ्याशी सोमवार मंगळवार
Malik sir, it's
Oh.
past 4. Should we wait for Mr. Chandrabhushan? You're on mute, sir.
Gangotri is calling him, just to remind. There may be some
Okay.
logging in problem, but I spoke to him in the morning
Sure.
today. He will join.
Yes, we'll just wait for a minute.
Maybe wait for a few minutes, yeah, till he joins.
Yes.
Gangotri, what through? Have you?
Welcome all the participants. We'll start the session in a few minutes.
Yeah, he confirmed he's joining in a minute. Okay, I see.
So we'll just start at 4:05.
Yeah, he's logging in. It'll take a minute.
Yes.
I spoke to him.
Sure. I'll give some basic guidelines first. So I'll start in a minute.
He should join in the next 1 minute.
Sure.
or we can start and give a bit of summary, and then when he joins, then I'll take on.
Sure. Let's start with today's day 2. Good evening, everyone. We had a very successful and engaging day 1, and we are now looking forward to motivating day 2 of the Decade of Change conference. We welcome you all and the distinguished speakers and the audience today. The broadcast of both the days will be available on the YouTube channel for your. Building upon the PIC Climate Economic Conference in January 2021, yesterday's session focused on what should the new future look like in a decarbonized world and how to enable it, and what are the cost of inaction that will be incurred by the grave impacts of climate change. Today's session will focus on the action pathways to realize the vision for 2050 and a rapid action to lay foundations for it in this decade. The conference has 4 online sessions in total and will have 2 sessions today. It features 22 distinguished speakers with diverse experience and deep expertise together. Thank you again for joining us today for the second day of the PIC Online Climate Conference organized by the Energy, Environment and Climate Change, that's the EECC vertical of Pune International Center. PIC is a think tank. It's 10th year and is working in policy research in diverse fields like technology, energy, environment, governance, and national security. The EECC vertical is led by Professor Amitabh Malik and was started in 2018, and it focuses on climate policy and outreach. Professor Malik is the founder member and trustee of PIC and also the convener of the conference. So I request Professor Malik to welcome everyone and share his thoughts about yesterday. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Aditi. We are waiting for today's keynote speaker, Mr. Chandrabhushan, to log in. I think while we do so, let me welcome everybody who is present. The number is about slowly increasing, so people are joining in. Yesterday's two sessions were very interesting because first was about the challenges and opportunities in this decade. We selected this title, Decade of Change, because of the IPCC report that said that it is this decade that gives us an opportunity to make things differently. And so therefore we have focused on the decade of change and of course what India can do in this climate challenged world. So yesterday first session was on the India's challenges and opportunities in the decade, where I started by discussing the complexity of the climate change, climate instability, and how it affects economic stability, and so on and so forth. But more interestingly, yesterday's second session was a youth perspective. We called it From Converting Promises to Action. And that went off very well because young people were the speakers and they spoke very well. And so yes, yesterday was a completely very satisfying kind of a experience. So today, let me welcome you all for these two sessions. As he said, today's first session will be on climate action pathways to 2050. We have taken 2050 because most of the world, many other countries, are looking for going carbon neutral by 2050. And of course, the last session will be 2030 targets for India, decade of change. And we are really fortunate to have Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, to conclude that session. So I see that Mr. Chandrabhushan has joined. So Aditi, back to you and take over and start the session.
Chandra, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. How are you?
Very
so
well.
nice to see you.
Very nice to see you.
Hello, we'll now commence with the third session. The title of this session is Climate Action Pathways to 2050. It focuses on long-term planning and approaches needed to navigate the climate-challenged world and how to achieve meaningful climate action. We have an interesting lineup of speakers today, and I'll briefly introduce them. Our keynote speaker today is Mr. Chandrabhushan, founder CEO of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. Mr. Bhushan has been engaging on a wide range of environmental issues through research, writing, and has remained at the forefront of several public policy campaigns. He has authored around 20 books on socio-economic and environmental topics. He advises a number of eminent institutions worldwide and was conferred with the Ozone Award by UNEP. Am I audible? Because my network is a bit...
Yes, it is all right. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Our panelists today are Mr. Siddharth Bhagwat, who currently works in public policy research at Pune International Center. He's a director at the CCP Environmental Foundation. He completed his master's from Germany from Trier University.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can't hear you.
Yes, he completed his master's in Germany from Trier University of Applied Sciences in material flow management and has worked on several circular economy projects in Germany and Africa. He is interested in EVs and e-mobility, life cycle analysis, and media outreach. He is a member of the 2041 Antarctic Foundation and helps people to adopt to sustainable lifestyles through his YouTube channel, Sustainability What. Our next speaker, Dr. Deepa Bhadri Narayan, is a professor at the Pace Law School, Chapman University. She completed her doctorate in judicial studies in environmental law. She is a consultant to the United Nations Global Compact on issues of corporate voluntarism and regulation. She is experienced in government advisory and is a member of the World Conservation Union Committee on the Environment Law and serves as the chair of AALS section on the law and South Asian studies and as an executive committee member of the AALS section on environmental law. Our next speaker, Dr. Gurudas Nulkar, is a trustee and faculty at the Ecological Society Pune and head and professor at Symbiosis Center for Management. His research interest lies in exploring alternatives to conventional market economy, environmental sustainability in industry, and issues in agrarian economy. He's an advisor and mentor to several organizations, has authored books and received coveted fellowships in environmental sustainability. He is also a Climate Collective Pune member and research scholar at PIC. And we also have a special talk by Mr. Gagan Sithu, Director of CEW, Center for Energy Finance. His work at CEF is focused on advancing the energy transition in India and globally. Prior to joining CEW, he was CFO of GMR Renewable Technology, where he covered strategic finance and growth initiatives. He also worked in investment banking industry across multiple locations like Tokyo, Singapore, London, and Dubai. He holds a master's in economics from Delhi University, Sri Ram College of Commerce, and an MBA from Duke University. As we have a very long lineup today, we request all the speakers to follow the designated times for the talks. I request Mr. Chandrabhushan to give his keynote address on true green potential of India to 2050. Over to you, Mr. Bhushan.
Thank you, Aditi. And first of all, I'm so delighted to see Dr. Mashelkar. So, sir, it is always a pleasure to interact with you. Mr. Amitabh Malik, I'm really grateful for inviting me to this workshop. I'm really sorry to be late for a few minutes. I had lost the password. So I had the link, but I was searching for the password to join this conference. So apologies for that.
No problem.
Now, I just want to start my talk by emphasizing something which I never did, even a few months back. That we start 2022 by not discussing whether energy transition, decarbonization, and net zero has to be done or not. It's given now. The commitment that India made at Glasgow last year of reaching net zero by 2070, and I'll come back to that 2070 deadline, as well as of the 4 midterm target by 2030 of decarbonizing the economy, meeting 50% of our electricity or energy, that is still not clarified, but 50% of our energy requirement from renewable, reducing the emission intensity of our economy. This announcement at Glasgow now means that we start 2022 by discussing how best to do it, not whether to do it or not. So this entire debate that we used to have in this country, and 2021 was extremely interesting because there was a whole lot of discussion whether India should announce net zero target or not. I'm happy that that discussion is over, and we are now discussing on how best to achieve these targets so that we have a net positive social, economic, and environmental outcome. Now, it is quite clear to me that this transition is not going to be a painless transition. And it is also clear to me, in many cases, if we do not plan well, this transition is not going to be a positive transition. It could be a net negative transition, whether in social field, economic field, or environmental field. Therefore, the emphasis that we should now start talking about, how do we achieve a net positive social, economic, and environmental outcome from this imminent transition that is taking place. Just a few days back, the hydrogen policy was announced. This is the beginning, because I believe that there's a lot more thing that we can do with hydrogen. I think the policy is a good beginning, but it needs to be strengthened going ahead. We already have, in a way, electric vehicle policy. There is performance-linked incentives to battery technology. Renewable energy has got incentives and promotion because it is now economically in the past, but now it is quite capable of competing alone. So from a technology perspective, I think we have made great strides in the last few years. Where we have not made great stride is from management perspective. All these things that we are talking about, whether it is renewable energy, hydrogen, battery, electric vehicle, industrial decarbonization, is also incumbent on some of the key reforms that India needs, which we are quite scared to take. Let me give you the example of one major reform to the distribution companies. Now, so far, distribution company issue has been dealt by central government scheme. We have gone through, series over the last 2-3 decades, series of, debt waiver and various kind of things that central government has done to ensure that distribution company reforms happen. But we are at a juncture in electricity sector in India that if we do not do massive reform in distribution companies, then the target we have set, for example, for reaching 50% renewable electricity and beyond, will become impossible. Simply because investors are not going to invest money in India when the prospect of return and risk, the risk outweighs return significantly. And that was also always there, but maybe manageable. But as the numbers keep increasing, the impact of distribution companies as a bottleneck, that perception is also going to increase. So some of the major reforms in policy is required to accelerate the technological, technology that is coming into the country and the technology promotion scheme that a government is launching. So personally, I am quite convinced and quite confident from technology perspective that technology will come. Once technology comes, it is economically viable, private sector will get in. You can see how Reliance, Tata's, Mahindra's, all the private sector are so confident about renewable technology, electric vehicle, batteries, and others, because the technology has reached a stage where it makes sense to invest and make money. That story is now becoming more and more clear. But there's a social story which is not becoming clear. Now, one of the implications of this energy transition is that India's energy geography will change. the map of India's energy geography will actually move from Eastern and Central India to Western and Southern India. And you can see that happening already. Today, Central and Eastern India provides us with 80 to 85% of our coal production. There's some amount of coal that is produced in Southern India and Western India. But renewable energy is being installed in Western and Southern India. Now, this has implications on federalism that we need to understand, because where we have coal today are also our poorest districts and poorest states. Whether you take Jharkhand, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, these are the states, and in them the districts are even more economically backward. From Dhanbad to Chatra to Singrauli, who are the energy powerhouse of India today. But the energy transition demands that these coal mines close down. The thermal power plants are phased out. But what alternatives we will be able to provide them? Because today, say 7 to 10% of revenue receipt of these states are dependent on coal. I'm just talking about revenue. But in these districts, these are mono-industry districts where the GDP of these districts are maybe 60-70% of the GDP is dependent on coal in some of these districts. These districts don't have anything other than coal. So I think while we are discussing the techno-economic aspect of transition, we are not discussing the socio-economic, in many ways, political economy of that transition. And that worries me a little bit, because if techno-economic moves at a very fast pace and political economy is not catching up, you have conflict. And that is one of the main reasons why conflict always happens on technological transition. That technology is moving at a much faster pace than political economy. And in this case, I'm not talking about mobile phone. In this case, I'm talking about 25 districts which are completely dependent, but close to 50 districts where the implications are very, very high for jobs and growth in Central and Eastern India. You're talking about 50 members of the parliament. And you can think about state assembly. And maybe about 100 million people who are dependent on coal. So one big issue of this green transformation, which is underway, is that how do we manage the political economy of this transition by ensuring that these districts and states are on board and are being provided alternatives. And therefore, this entire discussion on just transition, which is picking up across the world. Countries like US are now realizing that if they do not handle the political economy of this transition, then this transition will face far more difficulty than what they had thought before. In our case, we have not even started thinking about it, what the political economic fallout is going to be. Last week, we released a report on Korba. Korba is the largest coal producing district in India. And I had on the panel, Dr. Saab, Mr. T.S. Singh Dev, who is the health minister and Panchayati Raj minister of Chhattisgarh on the panel to talk about it. And his entire speech focused on justice. And he said that the freight equalization policy, which provided coal at the same price across India, meant that Eastern and Central India never got industrialized. We only remained a resource extraction part of the country because national development was so important. But now, with the transition happening, so we suffered, and our tribals suffered, and forests suffered when the coal extraction happened and mines were open, and we are going to suffer when these things are going to close down now. So his entire speech was on the justice element of transition, and I think it is an important issue that we should be discussing. As I said, the transition should not happen in a way that the poorer part of the country become even more poorer. I think that is an important issue that we all need to consider. The second point is finance. Gagan is on this panel, and I'm sure he will touch upon the issue of finance and from where it should come. But let me say that the climate finance debate in India is still a debate which was fine in 20th century, not in 21st century. What I mean to say is that today we have an extremely capable private sector, or as well as domestic resources, who will be able to attract foreign capital and raise capital domestically. So India of 2020 is not India of even 2000. We are a much more financially capable country as far as raising transition finance is concerned. The second point is that India now sits on high table. We are part of G20 with aspiration to be on the Security Council. Now, when you are at high table, you do not get grant. Neither you should expect grant. So this entire discussion that happens on climate finance, that India is a poor developing country, we are victim of climate change, and developed countries should give us public grant, I don't think it's going to materialize now. So one, our expectation on what kind of money we need for climate finance needs to be moderated and refined. As far as, so what kind of money India will get? India will get investments. And therefore, the entire climate finance in India should be about how do we get investment which is at a reasonable cost. Because today, if you are a vulnerable country, you are viewed as a risky investment and the cost of capital is high. This is a dichotomy in global climate debate, that the victim of climate change actually ends up
I think we have lost Mr. Chandrabhushan. We'll wait for a minute for him to join back.
I think I'm sorry, there was.
No problem. Please continue.
So let me come back to the finance point, and I'm going to end with this, that a discussion on change in global financial architecture is important now for countries like India to get investment, climate investment, which is reasonable, which does not victimize us, because we are now more vulnerable to climate change. And as the impact of climate change is going to become more and more visible, and it will, we will be viewed as more risky investments. So one is that I think India's entire focus on climate finance now should be how do we reform global financial architecture? That's an important issue of discussion that should happen, and we should, and within that, how should we get investment to build our energy transition capital? And the capital requirement is going to be very high. Prime Minister talked about $1 trillion at Glasgow. I think that $1 trillion is only required for renewable energy transition. It is not, the kind of money that we will require for adaptation, loss and damage, just transition. Building a climate resilient infrastructure is going to be even more higher. I don't think there is any estimate on that number. Many people have given some number on how much resources will be required for net zero and others, but those are largely technology transition number. These are not the amount of resources that will be required for investment in cold region or in building resilient infrastructure. So our requirement for money is going to be very, very high. And that we can get at a reasonable rate and in a predictable manner if there is a discussion on global financial architecture. Let me end by bringing the issue of how we should as a country deal with climate. And I'm more focusing on the institutional aspect of climate action and energy and just transition. Currently, everything is centered in Delhi. Union government negotiates, union government puts out India's commitment. It is within the constitutional right, within our constitution, for union government to do it. But the fact is, the kind of climate action that will be required will have to be done by state and local body. And I'm so happy that recently I heard a few of the state ministers, Mrs. Sangma from Meghalaya, I think Mr. Thackeray from Maharashtra and others, talking about the need for a institutional setup for climate action and how do we move ahead. I think there is time now for India to think about a climate legislation and an institutional setup, a federal setup with very clear responsibility at district and state level to implement climate change. Because so far, frankly, things have happened on an auto mode. Renewable energy has come because of certain government policy, but frankly, private sector has found space in it and has run with it. And I'm sure so will happen with hydrogen. But the complicated political economy issue that is going to emerge, I don't think central government can handle without having a really strong institutional structure. Just for example, if there are 2 thermal power plants of same capacity and same vintage in 2 states, then who should close first? I'm just throwing a question in front of all of you. Okay. Which thermal power plant should close first and on what basis? Now, these are kind of federal questions that will come. We'll have to set up principle on which this transition will happen. And these are, just the kind of question that will hit us in next 4 to 5 years. But to answer these questions 5 years hence, we must start preparing now. And this is what I think has to be the discussion in the country. And as I started by saying, I'm delighted that we are not discussing whether we should do it or not. Now we are discussing how we should do it. So thank you very much. And I'm really so happy to be part of this panel. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrabhushan, for that very insightful talk and talking about so many dimensions, right from global infrastructure, from finance to local setups to actually deal with the problems at grassroots. We will now we'll now shift to the panel discussion, and I invite Mr. Siddharth Bhagwat to give his talk on net carbon neutrality, key approach for future. Over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you very much, Aditi. So carbon neutrality is a very broad, big subject, and I'll try to encompass it in the given time. But I'd like to start by sharing my presentation. Yeah. So carbon neutrality, like I said, is a very broad subject, and covering it in the given time is going to be a challenge, but I'll do my best. First of all, I'd like to thank PIC for giving me this opportunity to speak about the issue of net carbon neutrality and how we can take it as a pathway to go into the future. So to start with, we need to first go back to the South Pole, the Antarctic, and understand why this is going to be really essential for us to have an argument on achieving carbon neutrality. So back in 2015, I had the opportunity of visiting the beautiful continent as a 20-year-old student, and having seen the impacts of global warming and climate change in front of your eyes in Antarctica, in a continent where it's not contributing to global warming, but it's still facing the impacts of global warming, really, really hits you hard. And these are one of the important climate tipping points that we must consider as an argument to achieve carbon neutrality. So let me just quickly explain you why that is the case. This is the Western Antarctic ice shelf, and it is currently melting at a very rapid pace, and it's expected that sea level rise could happen to 3 and 4 meters in the coming century. And that is going to have a massive impact in coastal communities that are living there. Second point is all the oceans, right from the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean are all confluencing around the continent. So Antarctica actually acts as a whirlpool to circulate the water and the ocean ecosystems. And if the melting of the ice sheets is having any effect on that, it's going to trigger irreparable climate impacts. So similarly, there are 12 to 13 other climate tipping points happening around the world. Antarctica is just one case of it. We had on day one, Dr. Roxy Call, who spoke about some of the other climate impacts that we could be facing and how it's going to impact India. So this is the premise why we need to become carbon neutral. This is the general understanding around the globe that because of global warming, we are experiencing climate change. Because of climate change, it's triggering a lot of different tipping points around the world, which we may not be able to come back to. So this is literally a do or die situation for humanity. So what is the general consensus around the world? Why do we really want to get to carbon neutrality? The concept is fairly simple. We are emitting a certain set of emissions into the atmosphere through different sources like fossil fuels. And through net carbon neutrality, we want to remove the equal amount of emissions from the atmosphere or stop the sources of those emissions. So the net impact we are hoping would be nil. It would be cancelled out. So you would, for example, emit 100 tons of emissions and you would save 100 tons of emissions by coming up with a new forest. So this is the broad concept around carbon neutrality. Now, which are some of the major emitters around the world? Now, if you really want to make carbon neutrality a reality, since it's a global problem, we have to understand what areas should we target. So cities currently occupy 2% of the Earth's surface, but are responsible for 70% of the global GHG emissions. That is a very, very massive contribution to greenhouse gases directly from cities. And these come from different sources, like from energy production, from usage of our transport, management of waste, construction, deforestation, and so on. But the question is, now you must be thinking, how do people actually calculate these emissions? Where do we come up with these kind of figures? So the GHG protocol has laid out a framework. It's broadly divided in 3 parts. Starting from scope 1, that's the direct consumption. This includes emissions from the tailpipes of cars or scooters or industrial furnaces or chimneys. So these are emissions that are directly emitted into the atmosphere. That comes into scope 1. And in the example in the pie chart, you can see for the region of Pune, almost 28% of the emissions are coming from scope 1, so from direct emissions. Second is the scope 2, that's electricity consumption. Now, in order to power a city, you need to have a power station. And not necessarily all the time the power station is going to be located in that city. It could be somewhere far away. But nevertheless, you're still using electricity coming from that power station. So this comes under scope 2. And in Pune region, it contributes to almost 42% of the emissions. And finally, that is scope 3. The indirect emissions. So this comes from usage of fertilizers, different manufacturing processes, and the inbuilt emissions in the material itself. So that comes to almost 30% of the emissions for the Pune region. So cumulatively, in scope 1 and scope 2, we have about 70% of the total emissions. And this is highlighted because it has the best, it is, let's say, the low-hanging fruit to start the decarbonization process. Now, coming to some of the benefits that we have seen on carbon neutrality. First of all, India, since it's a developing country, it has great potential for development. We all support and want development. But if we want to have carbon neutrality as a subset, as one of the targets, we need to ensure low carbon development. And as Mr. Chandrabhushan mentioned in his talk, the RE sector plays a very, very crucial role in it. And there are multiple reforms that we need to take to transition to RE. So renewable energy has a great potential to play a role in decarbonization. Second thing is improving the energy efficiency and reducing energy demand. So that increases the productivity of the tasks that we do. And it also decreases the need for any kind of additional energy in those cases. Third thing is efficient and zero emission logistics and transport. So just to explain this, we're all talking about electric vehicles. It's catching up a lot of pace. And if taxi riders or rickshaw drivers were to adopt EVs, you'll see that they're saving up a lot of money just by switching to electric vehicles. And of course, the charging of these electric vehicles needs to come from renewable energy at the end of the day. But still, even if the power is coming from coal, we are still seeing a slight decrease in emissions because of the efficiency factor. So you need a lot less energy to travel those same 100 kilometers with electric technology. So the impact right from the different spheres of our society is going to be different, and it's going to be advantageous in most cases. So it's going to lead to inclusive development. And one of the main benefits, like it was clearly mentioned in the youth session yesterday, is that we want clean water bodies, we want clean air, clean soil for the future generations. Like I mentioned, there are multiple climate tipping points going on around the world, and it's going to become increasingly difficult if we don't act on some of these basic necessities that we need. It also provides us with a market opportunity. So companies, brands today can improve their environmental performance, market it, sell it from that perspective. Of course, we need to be careful of greenwashing, where companies don't give out more benefits than what's been actually happening. Then building climate resilience, very important to combat the extreme weather events that we're expecting in the coming decades. And finally, it's going to be a very financially sustainable model as well. So today we see solar that has the lowest cost of electricity production, EVs much cheaper to run and operate. And SEBI has also laid out clear guidelines on environment, social, and governance framework for companies to disclose their performances to the public. And that's going to play a massive impact in how people and the public make different decisions. So coming to the international efforts at place, of course, we've seen a lot of benefits associated with carbon neutrality. So on an international forum, there's been a lot of efforts taken there. Starting with the mechanisms, there's multiple ways in which you can achieve carbon neutrality. So first is carbon offsets. You produce 100 tons of emissions, and you can invest in another project that's saving the similar 100 tons of emissions. So that is carbon offsets. That's one of the ways you can achieve that. Carbon sequestration, again, if you're producing 100 tons, you invest in a forest or you adopt a forest that's saving those 100 tons of emissions. Then cutting down on direct sources of emissions, which is one of the best ways you can cut down on overall emissions. And of course, carbon credits and carbon tax. It's currently not yet legalized or put in place with some framework in India, but we're hoping that this can be taken up. So in Sweden, where they're taking up a lot of carbon tax, they're using this financial resource to invest in climate action. So this is one of the things that we can explore as well. So globally, since cities are one of the major polluting sources, there's been a lot of organizations that have come up to support cities that want to go carbon neutral, like C40's Carbon Neutral Alliance. And the Maharashtra government has signed with the Race to Zero campaign to make 43 Amrit cities within the state carbon neutral in the coming years. So Maharashtra has already taken that first step in at least putting out a dedicated public outreach that we are going to make these cities carbon neutral. And that is, I think, a positive step in the right direction. So finally, the GHG protocol, like I mentioned earlier, it governs the framework of how you calculate your emissions, which is also very important to take into consideration. So now coming to the aspiration, that is we want to achieve carbon neutrality, we need to have some sort of practical approach. Today, more than 700 cities have already committed to go carbon neutral in the coming years through the Race to Zero campaign, but very handful of them have an actual action plan and strategy on how to get there. So this is a different ballgame altogether. And realizing this, PIC wrote a policy paper back in 2020, which was then inaugurated by our Minister Shri Aditya Thackeray, where we try to figure out how Pune metropolitan region as a whole, which includes Pune, the city of Pimpri-Chinchwad, and nearby villages, how this entire region as a whole can become carbon neutral by 2030. And we did this study just before the pandemic with the help of local climate experts in Pune as well. Some of them are soon going to be talking in the following sessions. And what we found out from this study was there are two scenarios in which PMR can develop. The current baseline emissions of PMR is about 26 million tons of carbon emissions. Just to put that in perspective, if you want to save those equal amount of carbon emissions, we need to plant 52,000 kilometers of forests. That's about 7 times the size of the Pune metropolitan region. So going from point A, which is the current scenario, and point B, which is the carbon neutral scenario, there are two pathways. First is the business as usual scenario, in where we realized that we could have almost a 3 times increase in the carbon emissions. So taking into account our capacity to naturally sequester the carbon through forests or rivers or lakes in this region, that would leave us with a huge emissions gap of 57 million tons of CO2 emissions equivalent, which will be near impossible to negate just through artificial technologies. So preferably that is not the way we should definitely go. Second way in which we can develop PMR is a climate action scenario, where we're assuming that we are using renewable energy, that the transport is electrified, that is powered by renewables. We have a zero waste management structure in place. We are building green buildings. So assuming all of these actions are taken within the coming years, we would still have a surplus of 7 million tons of CO2 emissions. This is what the policy paper brought out, which was quite shocking. And to negate those 7 million tons of emissions, we again need to see two scenarios. First is using the natural sequestration capacity, we can still negate 2 million tons of it. But what has really come out is that we still need artificial sequestration. We still need to have some dependency on technologies where we can remove the carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. So this is going to be the need of the hour, so to speak. And that is the best way to achieve carbon neutrality.
Siddharth, if I may interrupt, please wind up in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So the reality of carbon neutrality is that different cities require different solutions, but it's also from the people's perspective, there are different motivations on why people want to become carbon neutral. So one could be ecological, knowing that we need to stop global warming. Second thing is financial, it's good for businesses. We can make an argument for that. On a personal note, yes, it's going to save us a lot of money if we use EVs or solar, for example. And morally, we want to do the right thing. So there can be different motivational factors for different people. And for the study that we are now taking up at PIC, we are now understanding what is the feasibility of making PMR carbon neutral. So this is going beyond the policy paper. We are looking at all these different sectors. We have partnered with local institutions and experts in the Pune region to see what are the technologies and what are the financial requirements of making PMR carbon neutral. So starting from understanding the status quo, we need to determine what is the emissions gap, which we have done. We need to then bring together all the essential stakeholders and start with key pilot projects. So this is a very important step to convert those aspirations into actions. This report is expected to come out by the end of April or May. So we'll be communicating that accordingly. But this is one of the essential steps that's been taken up, very new step that's been taken up in India, actually. But do we actually need carbon neutrality? Is carbon neutrality the final grail that we should all stick by? We all have seen this graph where this is the historical emissions and this is what our current emissions are at. But carbon neutrality will mean we are emitting, we are saving, we are emitting, we are saving, we are emitting, we are saving. So we might have emission scenario going in a lateral manner. If we really want to stop global warming, our focus in the future should also be to go towards carbon negative. This is a very important step. And of course, nonetheless, carbon neutrality is the first step we need to achieve, beyond which we can think about carbon negativity. And PMR as a region, since it has lots of research institutions, NGOs, think tanks, has a really, really great opportunity to be one of the leaders to make a huge metropolitan region carbon neutral. And we hope that other cities are also able to adopt this and take it forward. So that's it. I'll end here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk, and look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth, for trying to put all that information in 10 minutes and achieved it. We will now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Deepa Bhadri Narayan, who will be talking about institutionalizing climate justice. Over to you, Dr. Deepa.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Good. I'm just thinking for a minute because it's 3:30 in the morning. So I was about to say good morning, everybody, but I know it's good evening, everyone there.
Yes.
It's so good to be part of this conversation. Thank you for having me over. So I'm going to do as follows. I'm going to talk about the legal aspects, and I'm going to share some screenshots or just some websites to get us a sense of where we are, so I can route my talk based on some of those images and charts that I'm going to share. So is that okay?
Sure.
All right, so I'll start off with the first one here. Give me a second. After all these years in Zoom, 2 years in Zoom, we should all be very handy with this, but we are not. At least I'm not. So here we go. Let's try this one.
Sure.
So I want to play this chart. It just gives us a sense of what has been some of the annual emissions since 1950. Can everyone see this?
Yes, it's visible.
To kind of look at the four major emitters or some of the major emitters and see how emissions have grown, and also locate India in this picture, right? And this goes until 2020. So if you take a minute, what you'll see is, of course, there have been pretty drastic changes in the emissions of both the United Kingdom and the United States and of China. But if you look at India, it's not been so dramatic. And I emphasize this because we need to place all countries in the context of their emissions, including India, in terms of expectations as to what should be done by all of these countries, right? And that's what comes down to the heart of justice. You've asked me to speak about institutionalizing climate justice today. And when we talk about institutionalizing climate justice, I think about it as how do we put in place norms, rules, and institutions, literally institutions, organizations that can bridge the gap between those who have benefited, those who continue to benefit, will continue to benefit from these emissions, and those that will not. And that gap between the beneficiaries and the non-beneficiaries of climate change is currently enormous and appalling, right? It's truly appalling just how few people are going to benefit from climate change at all. And the question for us really is, how do we bridge this? Is enough being done? So I want to show one more chart, and then I will launch, and then you'll wish I kept on showing you charts, because then I'll keep talking. So if you give me a minute here. Can everyone see this? The map?
No, actually, we can still see the older chart.
Is this the new one?
Yeah, not yet.
I think you have to stop sharing first and then share the new one again.
Oh, got it. Yes.
Okay.
I found it.
was
Thank
visible
you.
now, but yeah.
All right. So this gives you the overall picture. And here's where we are in India, right? It's been going up, but if you can look at the map, both in terms of the global scale and the scale in India, you can just get an immediate sense of which are the countries with higher emissions and which are the ones with lower emissions. I'll stop this very quickly and move to my next one, which is vulnerability, right? So where are we in terms of vulnerability? So this is a report that was compiled by HSBC. And as you can see, India is number one. This is from 2018. So it's been 2 years and 4 years now. But of course, with COVID, we probably haven't seen many updates, but it has not been that long. So India is number one in terms of countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change, right? So I promised to bring this together. And I want to share with you just two more screens. This one is the UNDP's HDI ranking of countries. So you can see India is at number 131, and it has been improving steadily since 1990. But you can see we have not made so much gains, right? It is not something to be dismissed, right? I come from India. I've lived in India all my life. I grew up in India. So I will not dismiss any progress that we have made, because we know what the complexity of the problem is in terms of bridging this gap. But look at the position of India. It's at 131, right? So we have been talking in the global context about how important it is to India to reduce emissions, and it is absolutely important. But we have to really think about, where are we in the scheme of development? Where are we today, right? Finally, I just want us to look together at this screen, where we're going to look at just an evaluation of progress made in different countries when it comes to climate change and the national net zero target design. And as you can see, about 4 countries have an acceptable scoring on different aspects, and there's a whole list of criteria based on which these scores are given. You have another 4 countries which have average rating, and you have yet another 4 countries that have a poor rating. Among them, China, which is the largest greenhouse gas emitter at this point, right? And if you look at India, we do not have enough information yet, nor do we have it for some of the high fossil fuel producing nations such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We really don't have enough information. So you can't even make an assessment, right? And finally, and I'll give a final snapshot for India, and it is this. This is our wealth gap, right? In a picture. If we had to talk about what is our wealth gap, this is what it looks like. 1% will own this, 9%, 40%, and here's the 50%, right? So I think when we look at institutional climate justice, where do we begin? I think all these slides that all these charts and images that I've shared with you kind of show us just how big the scale is of climate justice. So what I would like to do today is offer a perspective on 3 things. The first thing is focus not only on the important aspects of technology, carbon neutrality, right, and net zero, but ask the question, has the harm not already been done? And what is this model that we are following today? Is it trickle down or is it trickle up? And if it's trickling up, then what about the people who have lost and who will lose? And that is an answer for law, right? When we set out a political system, a country built on a constitution, built on certain principles, what we have done is we've promised that it's going to be working for almost everyone, right? And nobody expects we're all going to be rich, we're all going to have the same income, you're all going to have, everything is going to look the same. I think nobody's naive enough, right? Some people are born beautiful, some are born intelligent, blah, 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 right? But there is a measure where there's a scale of equity that just needs to be maintained. And I think with climate change, that threshold has not been anywhere close to being met. So the first problem, I think, is how we define at the international level what countries are permitted to do. And our legal system, and this has, I think, been a problem for decades in the global international scenario. Our international system allows and goes ahead and says, well, it's up to the nations to decide what commitments they undertake. And so we are not going to do anything that's not in the interest of our country. But if you look at all the charts, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are you doing enough in the interest of the country, right? How do you justify the massive amounts of loss that people are going to suffer and yet find that you're doing enough for the country? Of course, the reality check, people will come in and say, yeah, but who is going to feed the people who lose their jobs in the coal sector, for instance? And it's a very real question. It's a very real question, but it's also not a fair question, or it's not a fair defense to refuse to take ambitious action and ask the tough question, are we doing enough? And also, secondly, at the national level, there is not enough happening. So we have not seen the kind of energy transitions take place at the national level for the past couple of decades. And we would like to say, okay, it's happening now, but we very well know that it is it's dependent on the political climate. If you have a group of countries with a political climate that favor climate action, that is going to take place. And if there isn't, there's going to be kind of business as usual, even though countries posture to go ahead and take action. So what has happened over the past couple of years, especially in Europe and also in United States, is that increasingly people have turned to litigation. And people have started filing lawsuits in front of courts and have started asking the question, are you doing enough? And this has been successful to the extent that there are laws that courts have been willing to interpret to provide remedy to people and to provide relief to people. But what about cases where the courts cannot provide a remedy? So let's talk about India, for instance. So this is coming from an Indian perspective because I'm from India. So when I first got into this field, the first question I asked myself was, what will happen to the people, right? We have a very innovative and well-known system of public interest litigation in India. And the first question I asked myself was, so let's say somebody goes to the court and asks the Indian judiciary to provide a remedy for climate change. What remedy could that court provide? What would it ask India to do? We just now saw what the emissions trajectory looks like, right, in India versus other countries. And then you think about that in the context of the vulnerability and in the context of the HDI and the development index. And then you talk about the internal gaps in wealth distribution. What is a judiciary to do? Can it even start providing a remedy without completely entering into policy making, which it is not equipped to make? And so where do we stand today is at a point where there is going to be a massive failure of the rule of law, a massive failure of the rule of law. And of course, coming from India, I know this doesn't sound, very terrifying, right? Because we go on, right? We manage. And when we talk about adaptation, if there is a silver lining in all of this, in India, people are used to adapting all the time. You adapt. If your electricity doesn't come on, you adapt. If something goes wrong, you adapt, right? If you're good at something, it's at adapting. But the question we have to ask ourselves at this point, and one, I think a gap that we need to fill is to see where should India's leadership go which direction should it head? Which other direction should it head? And one of the other directions I think it should head in is not just asking for money, right? Like our keynote speaker very, succinctly put it, we don't want to be seen just as another, developing country, right? There's that pride of nations, but we are, and it's not a fault of ours. It's a historical. There are historical reasons why countries are poor. It's not an aberration. It did not happen because countries only mismanaged or just countries were formed poor. We know historically there have been colonization, a past of colonization, because of which we know we are where we are because of deliberate policies that have been taken and ignored at the international level. So the leadership, we need to really look at it, ask who is going to pay, and why should we be joining the conversation midpoint and ignore the past? Why should we not ask, why aren't you paying loss and damages? So which brings us to Glasgow. And what happened in Glasgow? No country wanted to commit. I know I'm going to stop, right? Okay, I'll wrap up, right? In Glasgow, we didn't commit on loss and damages, right? And so to wrap up, I will end with one positive observation, which is recently the Human Rights United Nations Human Rights Commission adopted a resolution recognizing a human right to clean air, clean and safe environment. And I think we are at a starting point where instead of looking at it only from the sovereign perspective of nations, we have started the journey to look at it from the human perspective. And I think if we are to achieve justice in the long run, we need to put human rights or rights of people and how they will be affected at the middle and set up institutional frameworks around it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. We know it's a very wide subject, so it's not fair to ask you to close so early, but it's because we want to accommodate all speakers and give them time. But thanks a lot. But thanks a lot, firstly, for joining us at 3:30. It means a lot to us. And thanks a lot for the insights on the historic aspect and the thresholds which are lowered, which we don't realize in terms of law. We just think it's in terms of environment. So that's a very unique, new perspective for us. We will take the questions after the complete discussion. So I now request Dr. Gurudas Nulkar to please share his talk on green low carbon development challenges. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Tell me when my screen is visible.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I was quite wondering how Dr. Deepa is awake, because 3:30, even in the afternoon, people sleep in India, not just in the morning. So it's been very interesting to listen to her. So my talk is going to be about green low carbon development challenges. And I'm going to start off by looking at only 4 things essentially. First is defining the low carbon economy, especially for India. What could be the goals for a low carbon economy? How are we going towards a low carbon economy? What are the things we need to have in place? What are the systems, infrastructure, and stuff like that? And finally, align. Just give me a second. Yeah. So that would comprise of my session. So defining, if you look at the textbook definition of low carbon economy, it simply says that an economy that causes lower levels of GHG emissions than the current economy. Now we know for sure that for India, such a very simplistic definition is not going to take us to the kind of goals that we're envisioning for the country in the next decade or so. So we really need to redefine the way the low carbon economy is going to work for India and is going to support India in its growth. First and foremost is economic growth. And I don't think there's any disagreement that economic growth is important. We need the tax collections. We need to develop infrastructure. There's a whole lot of India which does not have the basic infrastructure, access to education, healthcare, so on and so forth. And that's going to come from the taxes, which are going to come from economic growth. So economic growth, which leads to well-being, is the kind of growth which we are going to look at. Reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is something which we have committed and which is extremely important as our entity on this planet. The third thing is the conservation of natural capital, which is getting scarcer and scarcer, the non-renewable resources especially. Some of the minerals have completely exhausted in our mines, and things like that. The fourth point is increasing the sequestration capacity of the country. And there's a lot of talk about forestation and forest cover, but there are other ways to look at increasing the sequestration capacity. And finally, and the fifth most important thing is about the job growth, which is today what is quite lacking. And the United Nations data as well as the World Bank data shows that there is jobless growth right now happening in many countries, including India, which means the economy is growing, but the jobs are not growing in the proportion that we would like to. So how do we get to these four goals, and what is the way to look at that? The United Nations and the World Bank in 2011 had talked about decoupling economic growth. And I'm going to take that narrative ahead and place it squarely upon the Indian economy. So what is essentially decoupling of economic growth? Decoupling economic growth from two very important things. One is natural resource consumption, which is in this parlance is called as resource decoupled growth. And the second is the impact decoupled growth, which means the environmental impacts, the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide emissions, the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, over extraction, or so on and so forth. So these are the two decouplers that we need to look at for the economic growth, which will lead us to the goals which we just saw in the earlier slide. How do we go about it? Let's first talk about resource decoupled growth. There are three very important pathways towards resource decoupled growth. The first one is, of course, raising the value add of per use of the resource, which is in shorthand, you can say it's resource efficiency. And we know for sure that India is not really the most efficient in terms of resource use. The second one is about raising the number of times value is added to a particular resource, which implies a circularity in the economy. So you take a resource and put it through multiple value addition cycles, and that increases the GDP as well as reduces the demand on new resources. And the third very important thing is raising the renewable economy. And the most significant in-your-face renewable economy for India is the agrarian economy. I'm going to superimpose these things on the Indian subcontinent and what it means for India. We all know that India is really, really low in terms of resource productivity, in terms of resource productivity in the compared to the world averages. And we have energy losses, we have irrigation water, which is used in abundance. Our water, agrarian water, irrigation water is not the most efficient in the country. Raising the value add per resource is not very difficult. We can measure it by resource, we can measure it by sector, we can measure it by economic process or the life cycle. All of these things can contribute towards measuring this. When we are talking about value addition, it's not just in the production process, but right from mining, converting, distribution, production, the entire value chain of the mineral is to the final product and at the discard end of life cycle. Increasing the value added per product in terms of higher value. So, for example, Dr. Mashilkar always gives this example of zirconium in India. So, India exports raw zirconium at a very, very cheap price and imports stabilized zirconium at a very high price. Now, if we were able to add that value in the Indian economy, that would contribute to the GDP. There are various methods of increasing the value add per resource consumption. So, for example, IT companies, when they move from services to products, they increase the profitability, they increase their revenues, while not increasing their resource use in the same proportion. The national resource efficiency policy is something which the Indian government came up in 2019. Unfortunately, it's not yet, it's still on the table. It's not yet taken up for that. And that is something which is important. Import dependence, we are 100% dependent upon a lot of minerals. And that is that needs to come back into the economy. They are all discarded at the end of the life cycle. Raising the number of times the value is added, and that's quite easy to see. We have tremendous amount of electronic waste which is just lying there: tires, pet bottles, white goods, plastic, adding higher value. So for example, today a lot of pyrolysis units have come up from plastic to fuel, but that's really at the lowest end of the value chain. Recovering polyester is something which is a little higher. Bottle reuse is something which would be the best. So increasing the number of times is something which developing products for the circular economy. Raising the renewable economy, the agrarian economy, is something which India must concentrate on. We know today that 58% of Indian citizens are in agri-related businesses, and they contribute not more than 15 to 16% to the GDP. Imagine if we are able to increase the livelihoods of these 58% from 15% to 50%, that and contribute towards growth. Agroclimatic efficiency has not been really good in Indian agriculture. In fact, we have thrown agroclimatic thinking. The renewable materials are something, again, which is that's the part of the low carbon economy which Hello. Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, sure.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, it's visible, right? Okay. So changing the resources which are used and using resources in more environmental friendly ways. So changing resources which we are using, the obvious choice is renewable energy and alternate energy. So PV, solar, heating, wind, all of these technologies which are now commercialized and very much waiting there for India to shift onto that. The second is about alternate energies, which means urban waste to fuel, which is a huge sector for India, and that can contribute significantly to changing our resource use in the energy generation sector. Mobility is the way you're changing resource use from private transport towards a public transport, mass transport. Unfortunately, India has lagged behind in the metro narrative, in the public transport, BRTS narrative, all of that. And it's time that we take rapid strides in this. Using resources in more environmental friendly ways. So for example, again, like I said earlier, changing the processes, disincentivizing negative externalities, something which really needs to come up in the Indian context. Environmental friendly products for household consumption. The most significant amount of pollution in Indian rivers is coming from domestic household chemicals, which is the shampoos and soaps and stuff like that. Burning biomass is absolutely not adding to the economy, it's adding to the emissions. If we are able to convert a significant amount of biomass into fuel, that is going to help the economy. And there are technologies which are commercialized here. Increasing sequestration capacities, again, there are two pathways there, the natural sequestration and the artificial sequestration. So natural sequestration, the three most important ways is above ground, which is forest cover, grasslands, wetlands, and below the ground. Artificial sequestration is carbon capture, utilization, storage, and ocean sequestration. I'm going to quickly move on to aligning the policies because of paucity of time. So this is how a low carbon economy for India should actually look like. We have economic growth and well-being going up, employment actually following the economic growth, resource use and emissions and impact declining. For this to happen, we need some alignment with the policies. The first and most important thing is the National Resource Efficiency Policy and the board has to be mainstreamed into the economy now. This is in the waiting for a very long time. For the last 3 years, the decision has not been taken, but there is a very important sectoral resource efficiency strategy in that, which needs to, our construction sector, infrastructure sector, cement sector, all of these have a huge potential to reduce their resource consumption for decoupling. Investment in energy distribution infrastructure, one of the speakers earlier said, we have a huge transmission losses in the large scale grids which we have today. Microgrids, technology enabled, for example, DeepMinds of Google is using technology, artificial intelligence to predict faults and actually improve the energy efficiency in data centers in the US. Similar technologies can very well be used in the smart city programs. Privatization of renewable energy, the ease of doing business in renewable energy is not really the best in India. The incentives need to be really tweaked to get to the right one. Tax regimes to promote circularity. At this point of time, we do not have any tax regimes which are actually promoting circularity. We don't have any kind of recycling infrastructure. It's very sporadic, it's very fragmented in the country and not accessible. Green economic zones, something which the country needs to look at. We have had SEZs for a very long time. The success has been mixed with SEZ, but green economic zones are zones which can promote circularity, can promote green businesses, startups, and so on and so forth. The agrarian market, if we need to increase the GDP sectoral contribution of agriculture from 15 to 50, then there has to be some strong policy changes in this. Most important are the agrarian infrastructure, access to energy, access to water and markets. Access to markets also is not equitable in India. MSP, for example, the minimum support price, we need to use it as an incentive for appropriate cropping rather than just looking at the remuneration to the farmers. Removing agro-market imperfections. Now, it's a no-brainer that the APMCs, the agro-marketing produced companies, have several market imperfections. There's hardly any price discovery. There can be buyer collusion. They're very far away from most places in India, so on and so forth. And that needs to be structurally changed right now. Mass transport infrastructure is something which is lacking in many cities and urban places, and that can improve the efficiencies, the emissions to a large extent. EPR, take back laws, all of these are just simply waiting there on the fence to be taken up. We really need to. Natural farming, soil carbon, there's a huge potential to store carbon in the soil. Natural farming is one of the ways towards moving to soil as a storage and sequestration. But we need to build capacity. There is no capacity. There are no capabilities within farmers, within the supply chain, within producers of inputs, and there is hardly any infrastructure. The natural farming crops are going to be more expensive in terms of inputs, but they don't get more prices at the moment. We need to have a separate market mechanism where they can get higher prices. The buyers need to discover what they are buying. If that doesn't happen, they are not going to be willing to pay a higher price, and then the agrarian economy is not going to move up. And finally, green entrepreneurship. That, I think, is a very strong enabler. We have a lot of technologies which can really be put forth and utilized for social benefit and for environmental benefit. At this point of time, we are promoting entrepreneurship in technology development, but it is not directly towards a social benefit or to fill up the gap which is required for the low carbon economy. And that, I think, would be a key enabler for a country like India, where the youth have got tremendous innovative capabilities and access to technologies, education. All the other factors are quite in place. Of course, there is a mismatch in the factor allocation between urban and rural markets, but that needs to be addressed separately. And I would, with that, I would like to stop here and thank PIC, Dr. Malik, and the entire team for allowing me to make this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. And thanks to all the speakers, and sorry for the time constraint. It was really nice that you put in the element of natural capital and the new ideas about new or more impactful ideas about resource and impact decoupling, which is not being talked about, and also the policies which are needed to accelerate this. So after this review about the technology, economy, and justice aspect, we'll now move to the finance aspect. So I request Mr. Gagan Sithu to give his talk on green finance and carbon pricing. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Aditi. Thanks for the thank you for the kind introduction earlier, and I'd also like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak and share some views on green finance and carbon pricing. But before I begin, I also want to especially thank each of the speakers who spoke before me, Chandra, Siddharth, Deepa, and Gurudas, for sort of reminding us that there's so many different facets to understanding the challenges that India faces when it comes to addressing the climate challenge that we face collectively, not just as a nation, but as one nation among many globally. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Give me a second, please.
Sure.
Is this visible?
It will be, yes, it is visible.
Right. Right, let me begin. Right, so very briefly, CEW is among Asia's leading think tanks, leading policy research institutions, and we have 7 focus areas, as well as a dedicated Center for Energy Finance, which is where I work. Right, I think some sort of context setting or some perspective is very useful before we begin. And I'd like to highlight 3 points when it comes to context setting and perspective. The first is that green finance in India has largely been driven, or to a large extent has been driven by rapid renewables, which is solar and wind deployment. What this means from a climate finance lens is more mitigation, less adaptation. And from a sustainability financing lens, it means a bigger focus on SDGs 7 and 13, which pertain to affordable and clean energy as well as climate action. The second point is that COVID-19 put a sharp focus on green in India as well as internationally. And finally, the big questions, what is exactly going to drive green finance going forward? Near term, it's possibly going to be India's NDC pledges at COP26 for 2030. Long term, it could be India's net zero pledge, again at COP26 for 2070. There's also the sharper green lens on corporates. This is both voluntary as well as coming from regulatory pushes, as well as adaptation, which is the big question mark, which some of the other speakers also spoke about earlier. Right, just because renewables has been such a big linchpin or driver of green finance, it's useful, I think, to just step back and primarily of installed variable solar and wind resource means that from a share of nationwide generation perspective, which is actually what we should be looking at, the percentages are slightly different. I've given you from the last quarter 3 data points, the average, high and low. The average is just short of 10%, but on certain days it's as high as 12.6. And again, remember this for the last quarter, or the previous quarter, which was actually not a very high generation quarter for renewables in the first place. But if we add 46 gigawatt of hydro to the 105 gigawatt, it looks much, much better. And after all, hydro is green. Share of nationwide installed capacity, almost 40%, actually it's 39%. And if we look at share of generation, just look at the average number, it's 20%. So a lot of us may not realize, but as a country as a whole today, when we turn on, our light bulbs, put on our ACs, put on whatever it is that works on electricity, on average, about 20%, at least in the last quarter, was coming from renewables and hydro. On certain days, such as October 18th, 2021, it was actually as high as 27%. So really, this impressive progress, particularly because a lot of focus is on green, has come considering that, India's national solar mission was launched just a bit over 10 years ago in 2010. So, we've actually become from negligible solar, then practically zero, to becoming the world's 5th largest solar market. Right. The second point I said was, that COVID-19 put a sharp focus on green, almost immediately after it. And I just got four sort of sample news items or developments that I've just picked up. And from clockwise top left, it's from March, July, September, and October 2020. starting with the first one from March 2020, we found at CW that in the immediate aftermath of the first lockdown, RE was actually, that's renewables, was actually the least impacted as a generation source. Moving on, it didn't take too much time for Tesla to overtake Toyota and become the world's most valuable car maker in terms of market capitalization. In July, Tesla actually crossed Toyota. By October, it was worth 2 times Toyota. And by the way, today, Tesla is worth about 3 times Toyota. And closer home in India, by September, Adani Green, which has a fraction of generating capacity compared to NTPC, actually crossed NTPC in terms of market capitalization. Today, Adani Green is worth 2.3 times NTPC. And finally, in October 2020, the green bond issuance has actually crossed the collective $1 trillion mark, and that's $1 trillion since they were first issued in the mid-2000s. So, this immediate positive push for green in the aftermath of COVID-19 also manifested in India and continued well into 2021. And I'm going to look at this from 3 perspectives. The first is policy. The second is diversity in capital raising or the sources of capital. And the third is more in terms of looking at supply chain and business decarbonization. So from a policy perspective, clearly some of the speakers very importantly pointed out the hydrogen story in India is fast emerging. Can we expect something similar as what happened in solar? As I mentioned, yes, in the previous slide, it was just 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years, that national solar mission was launched. Can we imagine something like this happening for hydrogen as well? We're seeing increased innovation in tender design to ease integration of renewable power. So, round-the-clock power, renewables, bundling renewables with thermal, assured peak power supply, and hybrids. Third, there's also a big push for domestic manufacturing, and this cuts across storage, solar PV, and hydrogen value chains. There's also been, moves on the margins, I would say, but very important margins such as redesign of renewable energy certificates. And as well as waivers of interstate transmission charges, which I think are very important enablers. But it remains to be seen how and to what extent DISCOMs actually help facilitate these type of mechanisms. Secondly, from a diversity in capital sources perspective, India's low carbon transition attracted capital in record volumes, I would say, in 2021. The international green bond market, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, but it was the international green bond market, not so much the domestic green bond market, was very robust. We saw M&A transactions, we saw appetite for broader low carbon investments, as well as forward-looking sustainability bond issuances. And again, just looking at this, some sort of sample news items from 2021, clockwise from top left. In Feb 21, we had India's first sustainability-linked bond. So, sustainability-linked bonds are different from green bonds. Green bonds are certified as such based on the end use of the capital that will be raised. Sustainability-linked bonds typically look at the company raising them to achieve certain milestones going forward. So anyhow, the first sustainability-linked bond from India in 2021 came in Feb. Adani Electricity followed very quickly with its own multi-billion-dollar sustainability-linked bond program, of which 300 million was raised. And bottom right, from August 21, we ourselves at CW actually released a report which tracked every single green bond issuance by Indian developers since 2014. And we found that more money had been raised in the first 6 months of 2021 by Indian developers overseas than in any previous calendar year. And finally, we saw a lot of robust activity in terms of value, at least, in the RE space. And then finally, the third thing I want to talk about was supply chain and business decarbonization. There's obviously been a push for domestic manufacturing, and this has opened up supply chain investment opportunities. And very importantly, corporates themselves are increasingly pursuing carbon neutrality. The topic of SEBI mandating BRSR reports for the top 1,000 listed companies was brought up by an earlier speaker. I think that's very important. But on the other side, I think there's also voluntary push towards carbon neutrality, because I think companies have figured out that it's a smart thing to do, to show green credentials. And again, I won't spend too much time on going through each of these headlines, but I'll move on to COP26. So moving on to COP26, before I get into India, it's useful to sort of take a look at what really happened from a big picture perspective. You know, there was net zero announcements leading up to and at COP26, both by developed countries as well as developing countries. There was the historic mention of phase down of unabated coal and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There was increasing alignment of private capital, very, very important, because private capital is critical. GFANs, which is 450 banks and financial institutions, representing a collective $130 trillion of assets under management. But against all this, you know, inadequacy of climate finance flows to developing countries. And remember, climate financing flows are not grants or gifts. They're just absolute numbers, absolute values of flows, some of which come on market terms and some of which come on concessional terms. Right. So what did India do at COP26? So in a nutshell, what India did was it upsized on some previous commitments, and it also newly committed on new things. So the first two rows talk about the upsizing of previous commitments, and the first column, or the second column, which is the one in the middle, is specifically highlights what India had committed for COP21 in Paris. And the last column looks at what India committed per Glasgow. So really, the first thing that was upsized was the share of non-fossil fuel capacity. The previous target was 40%, and that's been raised to 50%. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, India is already at 39%, so not a big surprise that this was raised. The second target that was upsized was the emissions intensity reduction, which previously was 33 to 35%. It's been raised to 45%. Again, not a big surprise, because BOR3 already highlights that a 24% reduction has been achieved. And that brings us to the new pledges. The first new pledge was India actually quantified that by 2030, we'd want to have 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel-based electricity capacity. Remember, India has mentioned this in domestic settings. Previously, it was 450 of RE, and this is the first time it actually went on an international stage and mentioned 500 gigawatt by 2030. There was also a reduction in emissions. Actually, this is against a BAU pathway. And finally, the net zero year. And I think I've highlighted in red the two sort of commitments that really beg the question, well, how much is this going to cost? And capital really does lie at the heart of this challenge, because whether we look at it from a 2030 perspective or whether we look at it from a 2070 perspective, the amount of capital that can be reasonably raised or is being raised today or is being mobilized is falling short. So looking at it from a 2030 perspective, I'm just going to read out a point made by the Standing Committee on Energy, which tabled its report on financial constraints in the RE sector just a few weeks ago in both houses of parliament, which says that our long-term RE commitments require between 1.5 lakh to 2 lakh crore annually, which is 27 billion. Against this, actual investments in the last few years have been around 75,000 crores, so 10 billion. So half of what is actually required. Now, if you look at it from a net zero by 2070 perspective, again, CEW actually came out with a report that just a few weeks after COP26, which quantified what it would take, and that number is 10.1 trillion. Now, I won't get into too much detail on this because I'll talk about it in the following slides. But really what this means is, we need more money than is flowing today, and that can be reasonably sourced from conventional sources. Breaking down this net zero number a little bit into detail, because that always catches everybody's eye because it's trillions, not just billions or millions. I'll just draw your attention to the last row, which is total. So the big finding was that we would require, remember, these numbers are not just for 1 year, this is for 50 years from 2020 to 2070. The big finding was that we would require $10.1 trillion in terms of capital to invest in the power, industry, and mobility sectors to achieve net zero. A lot of it, by the way, and again, this was highlighted by speakers earlier, and this is, totally agree with them. A lot of it can actually be mobilized from conventional sources, both domestic and international. So about 6.5 of it can be mobilized from conventional sources. There is a gap of 3.5 trillion, but we also feel that it's not as if India is seeking this as a gift, but some sort of capital which comes in on concessional terms or concessional support can actually mobilize that investment gap. And then finally, moving on again from what happened, right after COVID hit, what happened in 2021, and moving beyond COP26, just look at what happened with the budget speech and the budget announcements. Climate action and energy transition were highlighted in the first few minutes of the finance minister's budget speech. A capex outlay of 7.5 lakh crores, this is about $100 billion, was announced, which again is notably 35% above the current year's number. And this is really important because, greening, as I highlighted in my previous slide, requires hard infrastructure on the ground, and capital expenditure is precisely what is required to fund it. But of course, the big question is how much of the 100 billion will actually make its way to green. And the third point was, of course, the announcement of the intention of GOI to issue sovereign green bonds. As I mentioned earlier, the corporate green bond market, of course, this is overseas green bonds, overseas issuances by Indian developers has been very strong. By the end of the year of 2021, actually, Indian developers had raised 5.1 billion, which is again, just, obviously since the 6-month number was more than any previous calendar year, it's obvious that the full year number would also be more than any previous calendar year. But the big challenge is, of course, that the domestic corporate green bond market remains lackluster. So can sovereign bonds catalyze that? And finally, I want to touch upon the topic of carbon pricing in a very limited way, because again, as another speaker highlighted, it's not something that really exists today. But in a way, a kind of carbon market does exist in India in the form of renewable energy certificates. RECs allow buyers to purchase the zero carbon attributes of RE. But there are some things that merit consideration and pointing out. The first is the mirror image of an REC is a renewable purchase obligation, or RPO. It mainly extends to discoms. Companies and industries are exempt from this obligation. Secondly, while we at CW counted almost 1.24 billion, which is quite a big number of RECs having been sold on the exchanges, if all the obligations were to be enforced, the supply of RECs would actually not be enough. And thirdly, it only decarbonizes emissions which relate to electricity. So, you need a broader market which captures, which reflects the emissions from not just electricity, but the balance 60%. And as India develops, there will be overachievers and those that don't meet standards when it comes to emissions. And a mechanism that rewards the former and nudges the latter is a really important policy lever. And that brings me to my conclusion. And I just want to highlight a few things and capture a few of the elements of what I spoke about earlier. And perhaps I think some of what the other speakers may have also mentioned. The first is that the climate crisis is not specific to any country, but it's global in nature. Second, in India, there are 3 transitions that are taking place in parallel, but at different phases of evolution. There's the energy transition, which is the shift to renewables. There's the mobility transition, which is a shift to electric vehicles. And there's a hydrogen transition, which has the potential to deeply decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. And I think real transformation will happen only when these 3 transitions actually intersect. So right now they're in parallel at different phases, but at some point they're going to intersect. And to a large extent, the technologies that are required for each of the 3 transitions actually exist today. And capital, to my mind, emerges as the principal challenge. And as I said earlier, a lot of the capital, most of it, in fact, can actually be mobilized internally, but some measure of international support is definitely required to bridge the gap. So that is it from my side. Thank you very much. And let me stop sharing my screen.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Sithu. You covered a lot of aspects, right from policy to starting from technology to policy, and also about green bonds, which is like a subject of interest for everyone, especially attending this conference, and also about sharing about carbon pricing with us, which again is a lot of debated and not really well understood topic. So thanks a lot for covering all those points, and thank you for joining us today. We will unfortunately be not able to take the questions because we have already run over time, and we have another very strong and big lineup for our next session, which is session 4. So I think we will commence the session 4 in a minute or two. I'll just start in a minute. Okay, so the session 4 is the final session for today, and it focuses on the action plan for this decade, which we need to execute to drive a climate action and green economy, and lays foundations for the generations and the decades to come. And we are blessed with a very interesting and very dynamic panel for this. I'll just introduce them now. So our first panelist is Dr. Nitant Mate. He's the director of Sea Green Solutions LLP. He works in the field of sustainability in the areas of energy, waste, and water management. He has worked with many international organizations like UNICEF, World Bank, PATH, European Commission, etc. Has served on committees of Government of India, Maharashtra, CII, University, and has also collaborated with University of Pune, engineering colleges, etc. for policy matters, technology, research and innovation, education and awareness building. He completed his PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Colorado. Our second speaker is Professor Dr. Peter Heck, who is the Managing Director of the Institute of Material Flow Management, IFES, Germany, and a professor at the Trier University of Applied Sciences. He has a vast experience in designing and implementing circular economy, environmental policy, and sustainability strategies at industries globally. He has worked as an advisor with governments, industries, and communities across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Our third speaker, Mr. Ramesh Venkatraman, has been actively engaged in ecological restoration since 2007. He is on the board of directors of the Society for Ecological Restoration, the leading world body for ecological restoration since 2017. He is the managing trustee of Junglescapes Charitable Trust, a non-profit organization actively engaged in restoration with over 3,500 acres of degraded forest restored to healthy wildlife habitats. He is a certified ecological restoration practitioner, the first Indian to obtain this certification. And he writes and talks regularly on conservation and restoration topics. Our fourth finalist is the distinguished economist, Dr. Deepak Gupta, with expertise in climate change, finance, agriculture, and macroeconomic policy. He is a former principal advisor to Ministry of Finance. Dr. Das Gupta is a distinguished fellow at the Energy Research Institute, TERI, and he is also the lead author for the IPCC report to be published in 2022. He is also India's founding board member of the Green Climate Fund and was the lead economist for India and South Asia at the World Bank. We will now jump into the discussion. So I request Dr. Nitant Mate to give his talk on 24/7 renewable energy and energy security.
Thank you, Aditi. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Sure.
Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll be discussing about 24/7 energy through renewable energy and leading to energy security. Quickly jump into. Okay, so setting the context. Essentially, there is urgency for sustainability in India. People have talked about the world over issues, and in India, of course, it's no different. In a city like Delhi, if you are there for a day, you are smoking 10 cigarettes. A number of people are dying because of pollution. Millions are displaced due to changing rainfalls and other patterns. So, as was rightly mentioned by the earlier speaker, that it's the climate change is here. There's no discussion on that, and how are we going to mitigate the climate change is something that we need to really look at. And renewable energy is one of the ways in which that can happen. We require energy for everything. We require fuels for domestic heating and commercial establishment, industries, fuel for transportation and commercial entities and commercial institutions. We require electricity for lighting and other applications, and the list goes on. So we are definitely dependent on energy, and that is something that we cannot run away from. And when we use energy, we get into the aspects of pollution. So when I'm talking about renewable energy, I would always look at the emissions as one of the most important factors. Also, when we look at energy, we have to look at sustainability of the energy sources and sustainability of the country as such when using that energy. Typically, I would always say that there are 5 aspects that one has to look at when solving any issues or any problems. And those aspects are on the left-hand side. We have to look at food, waste, water, health, and energy in a holistic way. That's the only way we would be able to solve a problem. Otherwise, we start looking at one and we start creating problems in the other. I mean, the classic examples, I can give a number of examples, but we solved our food problem by getting into green revolution, and then we create a problem with the land by putting more and more fertilizers in the land, and then reducing the overall organic carbon from the land, releasing all that carbon out, and that is also adding to the emissions today. We have tremendous problem with waste, and I don't have to go into details of that. Essentially, if you look at on the right-hand side, we have a number of resources. We have land, minerals, water, biomass, and everything. Whatever we want to do, we need energy. Any conversion, any use that we want to do for any of these resources, we require energy. And when we are looking at energy, we are also looking at emissions. Hence, we getting into the new paradigm have to look at a number of shifts in paradigms. One is, we have been talking about growth. I think we should be looking at development rather than growth and focus on that. Then we are looking at energy efficiency most of the times, but I think the first step would be to reduce the demand for energy. We are looking at fuels. We should always be looking at renewable energy as part of the fuels. Then everybody talks about upfront cost. We should be looking at life cycle carbon footprint rather than upfront cost. Waste management is something that we are looking at, but I think first thing to do is reduce the waste. Waste reduction is what we should be looking at. We are talking about consumption, we should be really talking about conservation. And then linear economy to circular economy. And I think the most important aspect in the whole thing is we are looking at large energy grids. Instead of that, we should be looking at a network of small microgrids. And that's the future of energy. So when we start understanding energy, we have to also look at emissions. And here's a quick look at where we stand. Siddharth talked about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. There is a pictorial representation of that. Essentially, scope 1 is going to be what you burn in the zone that you are looking at. He talked about Pune metropolitan region. So whatever you are burning in the Pune metropolitan region actually emits directly in the region. Even the solid waste that we generate adds to the waste in the Pune metropolitan region. Of course, the vehicles add to that and so on and so forth. But I think most importantly, the scope 2, which was like 42% of the total emissions, is something that we should be looking at, because that is coming from electricity, which is not getting produced in the area where you are looking at the emissions. And this is a very important aspect, looking at the total energy scenario of the country. And of course, scope 3 emissions are something which are happening outside of the zone that you are looking at, but they are happening because of the consumption that you are doing in that zone. So may it be food, may it be transportation going from, traveling outside your zone, and so on and so forth. So quickly looking at what is happening inside your zone, or what is happening in terms of emissions when you consume some fuel. This is a table that I would want to quickly explain. Any fuel that you use typically is associated with emissions. So the first column gives the fuel, or the last entry in that is electricity. I'll quickly talk about that as well. But when you're using diesel, if you use 1 ton of diesel, it actually emits 3.14 tons of carbon dioxide. Now, if you are using gasoline, there is some other number. CNG is 2.75, coal is 1.51. But the last entry is the electricity that you are using. Actually, every megawatt hour of electricity that we use is leading to 0.82 tons of carbon dioxide emission. And of course, you can look at the calorific value of fuel and how much work that burning of that particular fuel will give you if that entire energy was to be converted in the work. And work here, I'm looking at kilowatt hours per kg of that work at 100% efficiency. And the numbers are great, but that's not the reality. That is not what is happening. Now, if you look at this table, it's a table on 2 pages. I'll quickly explain what this is. It's a very busy table. What you are actually looking here is the different fuels in the first column. And then we have different applications that we use the fuel for. Then the third column gives you the typical efficiencies in which these applications are there. And then in kg, if I were to produce an output of 1000 kilowatt hours, that is 1 megawatt hour from this particular fuel at this particular efficiency, how much fuel will I consume? And if I know the fuel I'm consuming, then I can actually come back and calculate based on my earlier table as to how much I'm going to emit. I'm putting this table in the perspective because I would want each of you to understand that if we want to do some work, say if I want to take an elevator from ground floor to 10th floor, then the work done is same whether I'm using electricity for taking the elevator up, or I'm using a diesel engine for taking the elevator up, or I'm using gasoline engine or whatever, even steam I'm using, the work done is same. So how do we compare everything? I think the best way to compare is to look at the output work that we want and see what input we have to give, and then work out the emissions for that particular input. Having said that, this table actually then goes into gasoline for transportation, then CNG for transportation and other applications, then LPG for heating and cooking. And the next part of the table talks about coal for various applications, kerosene for various applications, and then electricity itself for different applications, say transportation, heating, then probably doing hot plate or induction or whatever, we are using it for cooking. Now, if you look at transportation as one example, because I would really want to drive this point home, that if you are looking at transportation as an example for use of electricity, then the efficiency is very high. You can have 85% conversion. And then if you say that I'm going to use electricity to produce 1 megawatt hour of output, then how much input do I need? That gives you about 1.1 megawatt hour or 1.17 megawatt hours of input. And that leads to about 0.96 tons of emissions of carbon dioxide. Now I'll go back to the earlier part of the table and start looking at if I use diesel for transportation, what is happening? Diesel for transportation is giving 30% efficiency, and I use about 360 or 368 kg of diesel, which gives me an emission of 0.84. Now, mind well, I'm looking at the same output, same work done. Now, if I use gasoline for that, then my emissions are 0.78. And if I use CNG for that, my emissions are 0.57. So all of us are looking at electricity to be the least polluting input for transportation. But what this table is telling us is that for the same output, if we are using electricity for transportation, electricity is the maximum polluting entity. Now, this is completely counterintuitive, but I think it is very important for us to understand that there are two different aspects. One is energy efficiency and other one is emissions. And if we are looking at carbon neutrality, I think emissions take priority over anything else. And that is something that we have to keep in mind going forward. So what are the solutions for that? And what are the sustainable solutions, and what are the solutions those are going to be giving us kind of energy security? Of course, first and most important thing is, as I said, it is efficiency for resource use. So we have to make sure that we don't consume too many resources. We have to look at energy efficiency, because renewable energy or anything else comes later. First is you reduce your consumption. And this table gives various measures one can take for domestic industrial transport, and I'm not going to go into details of that. But energy efficiency is number one. When we are looking at energy, we can look at energy and matter, and they are interconvertible. On Earth, if we are producing energy by using matter, then we have to remember that matter is finite. And we have to avoid doing that. I mean, there are a number of ways. I mean, there is gas, there are solids, there are liquids, you can burn them. Even nuclear energy is there, but all of them are finite resources. Fortunately for us on Earth, we have an infinite source of energy, which is coming from outside of Earth, and that is sun. And so we should be finding ways and means of harnessing sun. Of course, solar photovoltaic, solar thermal is there, wind, hydro, bio are all the ways and means of harnessing the sun. What happens in India? Do we have enough sun? Do we have enough potential? And fortunately for us, India has got excellent potential being a tropical country. We have 3.28 million square kilometers. Our average solar radiation per square meter on Indian soil or on Indian ground is 5.5 kilowatt hours per square meter. Now, if you look at this number, it is about 7.5 times of total annual energy consumption of India coming to us in a day. So I don't think there is any doubt that we have enough energy available. It's a question of how do we use it. Do we have sufficient rainfall? Yes, we do. I mean, 1.05 meters is the total average rainfall on the entire area of India. That is enough water to give 2 crop cycles and probably have more for the 3rd crop cycle, and enough to drink and enough to keep for the next year if there is partial drought. So it's a question of managing. We have large cultivable land that we can use. Wind potential, of course, every year the wind potential is keeping on increasing because the technology is improving, and we have got about 300 gigawatts of wind potential at 100-meter mast height and 700 gigawatt when it goes to 120-meter mast height. Bioenergy, of course, we have very large potential of 42 gigawatts with excess biomass that we have. And most important thing about India, we were talking about economics, we were talking about funding. We have a very large population. That means we have in-house large market. We are 20% of the world. We have economy of scale. So we should not be, looking at funding from outside. We should be looking at funding from within. So we have solar photovoltaic, solar thermal, hydro, wind energy, and bioenergy. What happens? Are these really green? Is something that we need to ask ourselves. Do they pay for their own emissions? And if you look at solar photovoltaic, it pays for its own emissions in less than 2 years. And bioenergy, if you take an example, it has got a life of 15 to 20 years, and it pays for itself in less than 2 years. So essentially, if you really want to go green, the first step that we need to do is focus on the core sectors going green, and that is imperative. So your embodied energy and embodied emissions are green. Once that happens, I think we have started walking the path. And the economics,
wind up in a minute. Sorry, but if you could wind up in a minute or two.
Yeah. So the economics of renewable energy is definitely there. There's no doubt about that. I'll just quickly pass through that. I just want to spend a minute here. When I said that the solar photovoltaic pays for itself, this is an example of 100 kilowatt solar photovoltaic system. If you look at the life cycle emissions of that system, and if you look at the life cycle emission reduction from that system, it reduces about 2,604 tons of CO2 over life. And it actually, if you reduce the emissions that you can attribute over the life cycle, the net positive is 2,150 tons almost. It is only 8.3% of its service life. Now, if you look at similar example for biogas, biogas has got very interesting advantage because it is using waste and it is converting that to not only biogas, but it also is converting to fertilizer. So you have a number of ways in which you are actually saving emissions. And the emission saving for a typical 6.4 ton CNG plant based on bio-CNG, the emissions that it does in the life cycle can be recovered in about 2.6% of the life of the biogas plant. So that is something which is very interesting. So we have energy source selection. I just want to quickly go over that. There are different applications: lighting, other electrical applications, heating, cooling, and moving. And here is a quick algorithm which we can probably use. If you have lighting, go for daylight. Then if not, go for renewable electricity. If not, then go for battery. The worst is grid electricity. Now, if you have got other applications of electricity, then first is, of course, go for renewable energy. If not, go for generator, your biofuel or CNG, LPG, diesel. Then you go to grid, because today grid is rather largely polluting. Then if you have heating and cooling application, go with waste heat. Then go to renewable in terms of solar. Then otherwise go to burning fuels. Then go to electric grid, and then go to renewable electricity. And then the last one is moving, that is prime mover kind of application. Today's scenario, it turns out that engines are the best. Then you can go to renewable electricity, then battery backup, and last goes the grid. Now, this is something that will keep on changing as we improve our electricity generation and reduce the emissions in our conventional electricity generation. Most important thing is the core sectors have to go from conventional to renewable and least polluting things. So in a nutshell, if I were to walk a path for energy security, first I should start with 100% measurement of electricity, water, fuel, and other resources, and then drive the reduction using policies, regulations, act, incentives, and penalties. Then go to reduced consumptions of the same. And for that, I need to do awareness building, behavioral changes, pledges, the economics, and so on and so forth. Then I have to go to alternative sources. This is a third step. So renewable and sustainable. And we need to look at life cycle emissions, life cycle costs, economics. It is important because it is local, it is hybrid and smart governance. Then last is the evaluation that we want to do in terms of whatever we have done. Look at the per capita emissions, air quality, water quality, and so on and so forth. And then we have to look at the economics. Most importantly, look at energy, health, food, water, waste as a collective entity, and then equitable availability. Most important thing is renewable energy is decentralized, it is local. So there is autonomy at local level, and that leads to energy security. And it is a sustainable, it will increase our sustainable development index. Today, India is 120th on the list of 165 countries. And if we do all that, we will end up developing a network of smart microgrids for a sustainable, sustainable alternatives for a energy secured and sustainable future of the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. for highlighting the complexity within the energy sector and the embodied emissions aspect and the choices which lay in front of us. And thank you for introducing about the interrelationship of things about materials and resources and energy. That leads us to the next talk, which is about resource conservation and circular economy. So I request Professor Dr. Heck to share his presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can see my presentation already.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for joining us.
You also see I slightly changed my topic while I was listening to your speakers. And I think I can very neatly follow up on my previous speaker. So let's talk about circularity and sustainability. Only one slide because I think I'm only the only non-Indian speaker in this session. So I'm from Germany and I'm from the greenest university in Germany. It's a fully renewable energy university. We have been this for more than 20 years. So everything I'm talking about, it's really out of practice. We are living in a reality lab. Okay, this brings us to the center of the matter, circular economy. I'm not sure how many people really have an idea about what circular economy means, because being a teacher, knowing a lot of teachers, a lot of universities, I can say most of universities still teach a linear economy. So they're talking about circular economy, they're teaching a linear economy. Circular economy is about what we heard already from the previous speaker, decoupling growth from resource consumption, of course. It's also about managing materials more intelligently. This means really thinking in closed loops. It's about not having waste water. Now tell me the university teaching students not to have wastewater. They're all trained to treat wastewater. Build resilience through diversity, work towards using energy from renewables. I think this is a non-brainer. And thinking in systems and thinking in cascades. And this is what needs to be installed in our universities. So we old professors need to change our setup, mental setup, to incubate a new generation of students. I want to share this little cartoon with you because it shows a lot about how this world works. On the left side, you see a white old man talking about climate change threatening our existence. And we heard about one of our previous speakers, India will be heavily affected by climate change. But I can tell you, nobody cares. I think not even in India, many people care. But as soon as this white old man talks about economy, means cash in our pockets, people get really nervous. So it's about money. If you like it or not, it's about money. And that's why circular economy is an economy. Please believe me, it's not about ecology and all those visions. It's really about a new paradigm for making welfare, for creating society. It's a new economy. And today it's not the time to go into very much detail, but I think we all have an idea that this economy might work. Sustainability could be a better economy if we reorganize our material flows, if we change the way of handling our societies. And this needs to be taught to our politicians and our academics. You know, this is a Kuznets curve. You all know the Kuznets curve, showing the relationship between environmental pollution or environmental loads and welfare per capita GDP. On the left side, when you are poor, yeah, you are not so much polluting from an ecosystem point of view, but then you start to develop and then you are increasing your pollution, you are putting a lot of loads on your sinks and you're extracting a lot of resources. The black line, the upper graph is actually empirical graph. That's how Germany did it, how Europe did it, how Japan did it, how Australia, how the United States did it. So that's why everybody thinks this is a kind of rule how to develop. So when you are poor, you are allowed to pollute till you are affluent enough to clean up. Or another way around, when you are poor, you cannot be resource efficient and you do not need to be resource efficient. And I think this is a big misunderstanding. From the projects we do in Africa or in South America, I can tell you, you can get out of poverty much quicker by applying circular economy approaches. By not having waste, you can get out of poverty, not by being wasteful. Why is it today a difference to the time when Europe and Japan and United States developed? Because today we have all the technologies here in this part, all technology exists. My previous speaker mentioned biogas. Here, when Germany was here, biogas did not really exist as a technology. So we went up here, piling up waste, building landfills and having pollution all over the place. When I was young, I was playing on a landfill dumping site. It was so much fun to play there. And I was so frustrated when they removed my landfill and put all those material into a resource center. So, but today we have technology and today we have money to invest in intelligent designs here to bring people out of poverty more quick. And this you can see here. This line actually coming from China, I have to admit, Chinese scientists share this with me. So you can develop, increase your GDP by not emitting this pollution. This means not extracting these resources, not loading things. This all is saved. And with regard to India, this is a huge amount. Same like China, same like Africa, same South America. So we need you to do this. And we need you to help, we need to help you to do this. This should be discussed in Glasgow and not mitigation, things like wind and solar. These are all non-brainers, anyway have to happen. So, well, I want to give you an example, maybe which also applies to your country. I'm just trying, yeah. Waste to resource management. I have two examples. That's all. One is, of course, waste. And my hobby is organic waste. I'm a fan of biogas plants. I'm doing it all over the world. And I also went to India. And I'm always asking myself, why is India really not using the organic waste? There is millions of tons greenhouse gas emissions from organic waste in India, which you could avoid. Avoid by making money, means by producing 1.5 billion tons of oil equivalents a year from your organic waste, and then not having the miserable working conditions of millions of waste pickers in India. This also goes for China and goes for Africa. As we are talking in India with Indians, we could take the Indian example. And as also my previous speaker said, this is cheaper than coal from an LCOE, levelized cost of energy. Also, solar energy is cheaper than coal. So why are we sticking to coal? This is something we are discussing also in Germany. Let the coal rest in peace and put these people into solar workers and biogas producers and waste organization systems and let them make their money there. A lot of win-win-win benefits. This is a circular economy. Coal is a linear economy. This is actually making profit for a few people, and they make a lot of money, but most people are not making money with this. 1 ton of this organic waste is 50 liters of oil. So whenever you walk around your urban systems or even the rural systems and you see something like this, you should pick a price tag on it, a potential income tag, and then you can make your business plan and then you can start thinking circular. And my previous speaker also mentioned there's all sort of fertilizer in it. Fertilizer is also saving greenhouse gas emissions. 1 ton nitrogen to be produced means 2 liters of oil, fossil oil. The same goes for phosphate. And you have this in your organic waste. So use it and you can make a huge contribution to your country, to your people, and to the global greenhouse reduction. How to do it is it's easy. It's a lot of management and a lot of technology which is available in India and everywhere. But it needs to be organized. There must be a political will and financing. But we have this one speaker coming from the financing sector. So money is available. Just to give you a figure, I'm not a theoretical guy. I'm a professor, but I'm very practical. I'm also have a company, and so I'm really doing advisory to real people. So this is business as usual. Now, this is best available technology, a resource center, and this is business as usual. This is a landfill. And you see, The investment for best available technology is very high compared to business as usual. But the costs of treatment per ton is much lower here than here. So this is the circular economy. It means investing in your potential. Potential is resources, materials, and people. Not investing in your coal power plants, not investing in your people and in your materials. And then you can have a cheaper life, a more climate-friendly life, a more sustainable value-adding life. This is actually a very simple thing. And also what you see here, why your government should be interested, as soon as you start to make money from waste, you pay taxes. A landfill is not paying taxes. It's just a problem. Yeah, but here you have a business running and you pay taxes. This is a real example from South America. That's I wanted to share it with you. So what you need to do, you must actually analyze where you are wrongly allocating resources, people, and money. Yeah, and then you must decide how you could properly allocate resources, people, and money. And for this, we can use our universities. There are so many bright people. Send them to the cities and the rural landscape and let them analyze what's happening. That's what actually Sid also learned at my institute to analyze and then to develop business plans on new allocation of resources and money. Second example, we talked about climate change protection. Of course, this is what we all are talking about. This is mitigation. It's solar, it's wind, it's biogas. Yes, very nice. But actually, this is also already behind us. This is something we need to do. It's a benchmark. But this will not save our world. Even if we start producing wind and solar only in the next year, it will not save this world because there's too much carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. Yeah. So we need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere urgently and on a large scale. This is what we call carbon sequestration. And you might know there will be a lot of money paid for a ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere. Right now, already Microsoft will pay you 100 euro per ton, and the banks are discussing up to 230 euro per ton carbon sequestrated per ton carbon sequestrated per year. Based on this, my idea of circular economy is this. This is a project we are doing in the Sahel, in the North African desert. The poorest countries in the world are there. And they still think they are poor. But now, because of a new circular economy approach of our problems, what we have, they have a huge opportunity potential to be a game changer, and then they can develop. The new oil is in their land because they have land, huge amount of land, and have a huge amount of energy. And if you have energy, then you have water. So we can create water how much we want. We can create from ocean water. We can desalinize for 60 cents per cubic meter. Yeah. So energy is without limits, carbon emission neutral. So we create, of course, nitrogen. This is one of the cash cows we have, but much more interesting is this. This is my new carbon dioxide pump. I will create biomass in the desert based on desalinated water. 100% renewable energy powered, and then I can store millions of tons of carbon in desert soils. And this will help those countries. They can manage those systems. They can harvest part of the system. Part of the system will be there to sequester carbon. And this will help these economies to grow, and it will help the world climate to recover. That's all from my side. I hope I could a little bit incubate you to become circular in thinking and acting. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Dr. Heck, for that fascinating talk. And I really like the way you started about teaching the teachers to learn this approach rather than teaching it as additional core. And we really could benefit with these advantages because, like you said, waste, water, and all those issues are a big pollution, are big issues for India as well. So we would really benefit from taking up the examples which you shared. We will now move to the third talk of the session. which is about ecological restoration and climate resilience by Mr. Ramesh Venkatraman, Society for Ecological Restoration. Over to you, sir. We can see.
I hope you can see my screen.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference, and more importantly, thank you for including this very important topic of ecological restoration and how it can play a key role in boosting or improving climate change resilience. Before we get into this main topic, we need to look at an important question. Why has ecological restoration become more important now than in the past? The traditional conservation thinking has been that if an ecosystem is degraded and if you leave it alone, it will recover on its own. So that is what we call conservation. However, over the last 5 to 6 decades, our natural ecosystems are facing a rate of degradation, which is much faster than the potential for these ecosystems to recover naturally. And this in turn is leading to a net loss, or what we call a net deficit in our ecosystem wealth. And therefore, there is a realization that conservation alone is no longer sufficient. And in order to reverse this to a net gain in terms of ecosystem value, we need to carry out extensive ecological restoration efforts. So what has changed in the last 60 years, which has brought us to this situation? Factors like population growth, rapid industrialization, lifestyle changes, and a high focus on GDP have led to extraction of natural resources at a rate which is much higher than the rate of natural regeneration or renewal. And this in turn leads to degradation of natural ecosystems. And the other important factor is the focus on infrastructure. Ever since the Great Depression in the US, countries believe that investment in infrastructure projects is the best way to pull countries out of economic problems. But the flip side is that investments in infrastructure, large number of infrastructure projects have implications on ecosystem health. This is the main reason that the United Nations has announced the decade of 2021 to 30 as the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, realizing the grave urgency to restore many of our ecosystems that stand degraded. The UN decade has two important goals. One is recovery of ecosystem health and biodiversity, and the second is enhancing human well-being in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this recognizes the fact that ecosystems provide very important services that are very crucial for human well-being and which go to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has also come out with a set of 10 principles for ecosystem restoration, and most of these principles dwell upon the dual facts of biodiversity conservation and human well-being, and it is implicit that the management of climate change is crucial how ecosystem restoration aims to achieve the highest level of recovery for biodiversity, ecosystem health, and human well-being. Principle 8 talks about ecosystem restoration being tailored to local ecological, cultural, and socio-economic contexts. And principle number 2 talks about social fairness and equity arising from ecological restoration projects. So the UN is clearly talking about biodiversity along with social equity and human well-being. What do we understand by the term ecological restoration? How is it different from other approaches that we normally hear, like afforestation and reforestation? This is a definition from the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration, published by the Society for Ecological Restoration. It says, ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded damaged or destroyed. So what we are talking here is facilitating or assisting the revival of ecological processes or ecosystem functioning, which in turn leads to the recovery of an ecosystem to the trajectory before it got degraded. Unlike afforestation or reforestation, ecological restoration applies to a wide array of ecosystems, many of which do not have or have very minimal tree presence. So you have aquatic ecosystems like lakes and rivers, which obviously don't have trees. And you also have terrestrial ecosystems which are not dominated by trees, like deserts and grasslands. Even in terrestrial ecosystems which have more tree cover, like forests, you have forest ecosystems like dry deciduous forests or thorn scrub forests, which are not having a closed tree canopy. They have wide open areas to the sun, large grassy patches and open areas. So they're not dominated by trees as we are led to believe, because the general thinking now is wherever there is an open piece of land, let us go and plant a tree there. Ecological restoration is also a very holistic activity. It is aimed at recovery of multiple ecosystem parameters or attributes. So we are looking at a revival of soil health, a revival of hydrological functioning, increase in floral richness and abundance, revival of faunal species, gene flows between various landscapes, and also improvement in the microclimatic conditions. So it's a holistic approach based on soil, hydrology, etc. So it's a very bottom-up approach as compared to tree planting, which is a top-down approach. Ecological restoration is also based on three key principles. The first is ecosystem integrity. By that we mean we try to restore an ecosystem back to what it was earlier. So we do not try to change a grassland into a woody forest. We try to restore a grassland back to a grassland. That is what we mean by ecosystem integrity, which is the key underpinning principle of ecological restoration. So we say that we are trying to restore native ecosystems. By ecological resilience, we mean building the self-sustainability capability of the ecosystem, so that the ecosystem functions resume and the ecosystem is able to recover mostly on its own. So we do the facilitating part of it, but the recovery happens mostly by the resilience. And optimal intervention, the level of restoration inputs or intervention that we provide is proportionate to the level of degradation, and also proportionate to the level of resilience that is intact in the ecosystem. So if the level of resilience which is left in the ecosystem is very low, it means that you need a higher level of intervention. Or if the level of resilience is fairly high, we need a minimal level of intervention. So it's a very scientifically calibrated kind of activity. Ecological restoration also has very wide application. It's not restricted to natural areas. It has a continuum covering both natural and cultural landscapes. So you could have natural landscapes like forests or oceans. You could have semi-natural landscapes like rivers or lakes, which pass through natural areas. They also pass through human-dominated areas. You could have cultural landscapes like natural areas within large cities. You could have sacred groves. You could have grasslands, grass pasture, grazing pasture lands within villages, etc. So it covers a wide range of landscapes. Now coming to our key topic, which is ecological restoration and how it can help build climate change resilience. Healthy ecosystems can help build climate change resilience in two ways. One is preventive role that they can play because they are the largest carbon sinks in the world, and they can sequester huge amounts of carbon, and therefore they thereby reduce the amount of global warming which is happening. And the other is a mitigative role, which is the role of ecosystems in mitigating the adverse impacts of climate change. Now, what is the relationship between ecosystem diversity and carbon sequestration? This is a very important aspect to be understood very well, because all climate change action now is focusing predominantly on planting trees. However, there are a wide array of ecosystems that can sequester carbon. And in fact, some of these ecosystems have a higher potential of sequestering carbon than areas with tree cover. So we have aquatic ecosystems like oceans, lakes, and rivers, intermediate ecosystems like mangroves, wetlands, mudflats, etc. Terrestrial ecosystems like forests, grasslands, deserts. Each has its own unique mechanism of sequestering carbon, and put together collectively, they are able to sequester the maximum amount of carbon. So the key question that comes up is, by focusing excessively on tree planting, are we missing out on leveraging on the total sequestration potential available to us? That's an important question that we need to ponder about. This is an example of how diverse ecosystems can sequester carbon. This blue carbon, which is carbon stored in coastal and marine ecosystems, such as mangroves, tidal marshes, seagrass, meadows, sand dune ecosystems, etc. And it is scientifically proven that these sequester and store more carbon per unit area than terrestrial forests. However, if these ecosystems get degraded or damaged, their carbon sink capacity is impaired or lost and adversely affected, and the stored carbon is released. So instead of acting as carbon sinks, they become carbon emitters. That is the result of degradation of these crucial ecosystems. And we know that many of our coastal ecosystems are badly neglected. We have a high focus on terrestrial forests, but our focus on coastal ecosystems is minimal, and therefore many of them are neglected and degraded and in need of restoration. What is the relationship between biodiversity and carbon sequestration? Let us look at an example of forest ecosystems. There is increasing research evidence which shows that species richness and structural diversity have a positive correlation with above and below ground carbon storage. In fact, such species-rich and structurally diverse forests sequester more carbon than monocultural plantations. That is increasingly getting proven by scientific research. There is also research evidence that shows that increased trophic cascades lead to higher carbon fixation in plants. So therefore, there is a strong case for changing the focus from tree planting drives to scientific ecological restoration efforts that help revival of biodiverse landscapes. So by doing this, we are increasing the carbon sequestration potential, and at the same time, do not run the risk of losing the biodiversity that we have. What is the role of ecosystems in mitigating the adverse impacts of climate change? I have taken 3 examples of adverse impacts of climate change here. The first is erratic and unusual rainfall events, which lead to flash floods, like we saw over the last 18 months, flash floods in various places, including Germany and China, which are unprecedented. It also leads to landslides, like we had in Uttarakhand, we had in Coorg, various parts of India, long dry periods leading to drought, lower water security. We also have extended periods of drought, like some parts of Africa are facing severe drought and famine now. This leads to severe threat to both water and food security. Frequent extreme natural events like cyclones. We had enough examples in India over the last 18 months, particularly on the East Coast, of cyclones creating huge damage to lives and property, not just in coastal areas. Increasingly, the cyclones are getting more intense. So we're having high damage even in the interland areas, 100 to 200 kilometers inland. So what is the role of ecosystems in mitigating the adverse impacts of such climate change events? We all know that ecosystems provide important services, and amongst these, disaster prevention, water and food security are 2 very crucial services that ecosystems provide. Let's look at some examples. If a water security is going to get threatened, how can ecosystems help address this? The health of catchment areas in the upper reaches of the Western Ghats, as we all know, are critical for water security for most regions of peninsular India. And there are unique ecosystems like the Shola grasslands in the upper reaches of the Nilgiris, which play a crucial role in water security by harvesting huge amounts of rainwater and releasing them gradually throughout the year. So they can play a very crucial role in mitigating climate change induced threats to water security. However, the fact of the matter is that many of these ecosystems that form the catchment areas are degraded and are in urgent need of restoration. Let's look at the threat of cyclones. we all know that mangroves are the best defense against cyclones in many parts of the tropics and subtropics. And in fact, in Sri Lanka, when they had the tsunami, it was observed that those areas where the mangrove ecosystems were intact were largely unaffected. And I happened to visit some of these areas and spoken to the people there, and where the mangrove ecosystems were intact, there was no damage to the buildings, even 300 meters inland. So that is the power of mangrove ecosystems for protecting us against cyclones. And most of the mangrove ecosystems in India stand degraded now, and they're also in need of urgent restoration. So to summarize, healthy natural ecosystems play a crucial role in managing climate change, as we saw from all these examples. Diverse ecosystems have a role in combating climate change, and not just areas with tree cover. Biodiverse and resilient ecosystems are more effective than monocultural plantations in addressing climate change. This is something we need to bear in mind when we talk about afforestation drives. Considering the high degree of ecosystem degradation in India, ecological restoration is crucial in the fight against climate change, and it is high time that ecological restoration, in the true sense, in the scientific sense, forms part of the policy for managing climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, sir. We had demanded too much by asking about biodiversity, ecology, and climate change together, but you managed to put it cohesively in 15 minutes. And thanks a lot for sharing the views on how to go beyond conservation with restoration and beyond tree plantation with a scientific temperament. And that, I think, is necessary for all habitats, like you mentioned, be it aquatic or terrestrial. So thanks a lot for covering so much habitat and topics in just 15 minutes.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you.
I will now, one request for the audience, we will not be able to accommodate questions even in this session. So any questions you have for these two sessions, please email it to eecc@puneinternationalcenter.org. My colleagues will post it on the chat, the email ID, and we'll try to consolidate them and revert with the answers to you. We have had very new ideas, so I'm sure you have many questions like I have. Our last speaker today is, it will be as interesting as earlier because I've listened to him before, is Dr. Deepak Gupta. He will talk on policy drivers for environment and economic synergy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this very inviting, very interesting session that we are just heard. I should mention at the start that much of my recent work has been for the IPCC, and the IPCC is coming out with a series of reports. The one that we're working on right now is the adaptation. It's going to be released in a matter of days. The one on mitigation will also be coming out in April. And right now I'm working on putting together the synthesis for the audience. Sometime that'll come out also quite rapidly. But that's at the very global context. And the story that I'm going to share with you today is on policy options and policy choices for environment economy linkages in India by 2030. So let me start sharing my screen there. I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, it's visible.
So this is so I'll have to go from a very broad point of view very quickly to what are the options that we have for us in India. So policy drivers, basically what we think we should be thinking about is a question of recovery post-pandemic. This is a huge thing that's happened to us. It's been a massive shock. And the question that we have are really three questions. Do we have the right macroeconomic framework to think about ecology, environment, and economic growth, recovery, do we have the macroeconomic framework? What is the issue there? Second, an understanding of how big is this challenge of integrating environment and economic growth. And third is the question of what policy choices do we have? So those are the three questions. So if I start with the macroeconomics of environment, there are actually two alternative frames. One is the standard frame that most ministries of finance, most economists think about, which is the one in yellow on the left. And then there's a one in green, which is the question that's coming up for us as economists thinking about how should we integrate environment in economy. The yellow frame basically has a standard demand side storyline, which is growth in an economy or income in an economy consists of consumption, consists of investment, and consists of government and public spending, and there's a net exports and imports. And the way we deal with environmental costs is thinking about the environment as a cost, as something we have to deal with. And if there are some costs, such as on carbon emissions costs, then we do green investment. So it's treated like the main focus is on getting growth going, getting jobs growing, and treat with environment as a cost and deal with it as best as we can. The risk is post-pandemic, this framework leads us back into the previous path. And what was the problem with the previous path? And that's on the green side of the slide that I have for you here, which is the new frame of environment economy really is telling us that this old framework, we need to actually think about shifting development pathways entirely. The way that India has been growing last 75 years, we need to rethink it. And the question is, we're changing the way we value different things in growth. And how, for example, the consumption that we're doing, what are the sustainable development choices in the way we consume things? What is the sustainability of the way we invest in our infrastructure, as we were hearing? What is the way, do we export mostly goods and materials that have huge, possibly huge environmental costs? So we try to integrate. It's no longer dealing with environment as something to be dealt with somewhere else. Ministries of finance, ministries of actually have to consider at the roots what are the challenges. And this is, by the way, the UN statistical system is changing. We are going to be measuring, we are being recommended that we measure consumption, investment, public investments, private investments, consider the environmental implications deep down. Problem is that environment doesn't have a price. We operate in a market economy with prices. Agents react to prices. We don't have a price for environment. And so the idea is that you impose some environmental taxes or subsidies. And unfortunately, the price system, even if we started to do this Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, the scale of price changes that you would need to do is probably so big that you're going to have a massive shock to the system on our hands if we wanted to do this. And that's why we go back to the idea that it's not just price systems that you operate with, taxes on coal cessors and taxes on how much you pollute, but you have to actually think about resetting the entire way we think about how we run the economic system. So so we are in a question here about how fast we can move from the standard macroeconomic model that we've been working with to a model which integrates environment into the economy. So that's question one. How big is the environment problem is also a second thing, because the reason we shift models is if we think the costs are very high and we need to do it. That is there an urgency? And the issue here is in 4 steps. Think about it. We think at this point of time, there's a reasonably strong conclusion that the environmental costs, degradation, other effects that we just heard about is so massive now that the losses that we are undergoing are probably about 4 to 4.5% of GDP every year. We are losing, if we had costed it, we're actually losing 4 to 4.5% of GDP every year, which means if we were growing at 6 to 7% in the normal conventional way of measuring growth, our real growth every year is probably as low as 1 to 1.5%. That's a question. We don't know these calculations. We need to understand it why. And the reasons are air losses. The PM2.5, the question of air pollution is causing massive losses, 1.9 million premature deaths annually. That's happening in India. Value, if you had to put a value, is about $44 billion every year in avoided in health costs, 0.5% of GDP losses, and massive productivity losses. So this huge Indo-Gangetic plain across all our cities, the costs that we are paying for the standard growth model, which is not accounting for these massive air pollution losses, needs to be factored in, and it is big. Climate land, we know about it. The heat waves that is happening in India already at about 1.5 centigrade change in temperatures is loss in working hours, 5.8%, full-time job losses, some measure of $10 billion productivity losses. You can't work for 3 months of the year at the rates that we were used to. Massive losses happening. Agriculture, we know the hydrometeorological calamities that is happening. We know the land degradation costs that is, we just been told by Dr. Narayan about the size and nature of the degradation that's happening. And then in water, we have 256 out of 700 districts in India which are groundwater critical or overexploited. Our water tables are sinking. So we are actually mining water now. And India has the highest rate and scale of reliance on groundwater. So these losses are so big that it's no longer possible for us to say that we can continue with the traditional path of recovery, that we can continue to do the traditional macro and deal with environment as a sideshow. We can't do that anymore. The cost is so big, we are not actually growing anymore. We are probably, if we measured it right, slipping back into rates of growth, which are incredibly low. Time for a wake-up call. So how do we handle this? Given this challenge, what is the policy choices that we have? First is to recognition of the size and scale of the problem. Once we recognize the size of scale of problem, then solving it becomes a matter of governance and resources. Changing the way that we govern ourselves and think about governance issues and changing the resource flow. On the yellow side of the graph, that's the model that we have right now in India. And on the green is what's the kind of shifts in policies that we need to think about. On the yellow, what we have in India is really top-down special mission frames. Somehow think of solving problems as a big special mission. It's an administrative governance delivery system, works actually quite well in some cases. And we know, for example, massive gains happened successfully in Swachh Bharat, in Jal Jeevan, which is the water supply through the pipes, the Ujjwala, which is getting clean energy or cleaner energy into the hands of households, the solar green mission. So there are things where mission mode, command and control from the top down works, but there are also many areas where it doesn't work, and you need to bring society back into play. And think of things like, how do we get the drip irrigation going? Because we can't keep mining. How do you get river cleanup and the sewerage cleanup done? How do you get crop insurance going? How do you get smart cities going? How do you get green India going? Those bigger complex things can't happen with top-down. Second point is private solutions. India relies hugely on private solutions, but so if you have water shortages, you hire the tanker to bring it to your apartment complex and supply the water. Unfortunately, it's extremely costly, and it's also hugely inequitable. The people who survive in Pune during the water shortages do well are the ones who are relatively wealthy, relatively able to, but it doesn't take care of the country as a whole. Third is laws and regulations. India is extremely weak in using Clean Air Acts. It's not using the Environmental Acts. It does use it, doesn't use it as much as we think it ought to be used. Contrasted with a Colonial Forestry Act. There, somehow, we are hugely able to manage it. And that's because forestry was always seen in the colonial regime as a place where the state had complete control. Now the question is, the state needs to do these things in a more balanced fashion. And then you have resource problems. India's tax to GDP ratio at 17% is completely out of line with what tax GDP ratios around the world are. We need to start raising taxes. But then it goes to the governance issues. Why should I pay more taxes unless I'm sure that I have confidence that the monies will be used for social welfare purposes that matter? And I have some numbers on how big the shortage. So the green, where do we need to go then? Given the problems that we have with the current system, it's about a whole of society approach. We can't integrate environment into the economy with top-down models. We need to bring whole of society, change air, water, land, livelihoods, urban, rural, financial sector, legal, statistical systems. Everyone's got to be on the same page. It can't be what unidirectional move. Second thing, got to raise tax to GDP ratios 5 percentage points and use price signals. You got to charge for electricity and water across agriculture. We can't have free electricity and free use of groundwater and no control over how that water is to be used. Fundamental changes, but try doing that in a society which is fractured and has intense conflicts, then you're going to have a problem. So before you can do any of that, you have to have intense consultations, a sense of oneness in society, that we are in the same boat. We got to make a solution so you got to bring the farmers in with the urban communities and start to have the conversations going. How do we use the resources intelligently and well? We got to decentralize. The power of this transformation has to be where everyone in society is joining hands. And therefore, that means restructuring relations between state and center, between municipalities, districts, gram panchayats. Formality is incredibly important. India is going informal. Informal's got to stop, because informality has this, it's useful in many senses, but it loses traction when it comes to getting things done. Jobs crisis. The jobs crisis is a big issue for India. It's the biggest issue that we need to deal with. And the issue then is really about turnaround. How can you turn around a problem which is the environment, a problem which is informality, a problem which is jobs, a problem which is, and turn those problems into assets. That's the essence of the story. How do you turn your weaknesses into your strengths? And India has incredible capabilities of doing that. And I turn, therefore, my last slide, and I know Rajiv is sitting there, and we'd love to hear from him on his thoughts on turning the jobs crisis into an opportunity. And I think it is time we started to think about national environmental youth services and have a goal of 5 million jobs in 5 years. Why do I focus on the jobs crisis and for young? India has the highest number of, or potentially at the highest rates of unemployment amongst young graduates. The numbers are staggering. It's about 19 to 23% unemployed amongst graduates coming out of universities and colleges in India. That is an opportunity waiting to be used. And you use that in services like this. It's been done many times before across the world. It has a huge checkered history in the US with the work plan administration. Now is the time for India to start to use it, train and use this massive resources that's there. Do it for 3 years, 19 to 26 age group, hire them, use them to do this transformation that is at the core of the challenge, formalize the jobs, pay adequately. And I have a comparison between what a national service for environment for youth, 3 years programs, 5 million jobs in 5 years. And we use them not directly, but through the non-governmental organizations and private firms. Give them the power of this youth tool for the transformation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Das Gupta, for covering everything right from the macroeconomic aspects to pricing, environment, and talking also about taxing and reforms and formalizing economy and many other aspects. And the National Environmental Youth Service is something which is very interesting. And it was something which was also mentioned by the youth in the second session, which we had, that they want to be involved more in policies and environmental work. So thanks a lot for bringing on that point. And I think the panel discussion also concluded on a very, very nice note where you said that we need to turn our problems into assets. So on that note, we will go to the last segment. We are fortunate to have Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, as our valedictory speaker. He's also the Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics and the Chairman of Board of Governors of the Giri Institute of Development Studies, Lucknow. He has wide experience and has worked in academia, government, industry, as well as multilateral institutions. He was the Director and CEO at ICRIER, Delhi. And Dr. Kumar has completed his PhD in Lucknow University and DPhil from Oxford University. I request Dr. Rajiv Kumar to share his insights. Over to you.
As a convener, let me welcome you and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Mashelkar, my first boss, I never fail to recount, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Mr. Amitabh Malik, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot for this privilege and opportunity to speak at the valedictory session of, I think, a very rich and a very interesting conference. The 3 sessions that have already been held, I was able to attend some of that, and I can see that a lot of new ideas have come, which are eminently, policy oriented. But I also feel very privileged to represent Niti Aayog here, because, this will come later, because we in Niti Aayog have taken up many measures and devoted a lot of resources and attention for completing for taking forward India's green transition, which is, we are in the midst of it. And I'm sure, and I say this with some conviction, that the targets announced by our Honorable Prime Minister in Glasgow about net zero in 2070, or a 1 billion ton reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, and 20% ethanol blending by 2025. I say this from what I observe, and despite all the problems that Deepak has mentioned, that we will overcome them and we'll achieve these targets. Not only that, but we will exceed those targets for various reasons that I can see unfolding before me. On the ground, in policy circles, in the industry, in the academia, and actually in the civil society as well, though, and I'll come to that. But ladies and gentlemen, I must begin by saying that the enormity of the challenge that India has decided to take up and has decided to address must be recognized, must be fully recognized, because no other country, I think, in the history of the world has tried to complete its economic transition along with maintaining an environmental consciousness and not only consciousness, but along with the challenge of reversing, as I think Professor Heck said, the damage that has already been done, not by us, because we have 44% of all accumulated emissions for a 17% population of the world. So it's not because of us, we've not been responsible for it, but we have been landed with it, and we've decided to take it up. And I think it's important to recognize that, and as I said, and I repeat myself, that no other country has had the challenge to do this simultaneously and not see this as a trade-off, not take it as a trade-off. And other countries have, and they all agreed, and they've all taken the route of saying that we will do whatever is required to develop our huge cities and mega cities and high-rise buildings and steel and glass and so on, and we will retrofit later. I've studied in England where it was known at the end of the Second World War that if you put your hand inside the River Thames, maybe you will lose half of it. And then they decided to bring trout back into it later on, and they did. Or the mercury poisoning in the Bay of Tokyo. We're all aware. So let me not repeat that, but again to say that I think the global community owes it to us, owes it to us that we have taken the challenge of meeting this global public good. And it is a global public good, and I think it's now well established that nobody is safe until everybody is safe, and everybody is in it. So I think the global community needs to take cognizance of this, needs to actually work with us to ensure that we meet these targets, and I'm sure we will do this. So the second point that I wanted to make here is that ecology, environmental consciousness, living, it comes naturally to Indians. We have a tradition, we have a very long tradition of living with nature, living in nature. We don't have the Occidental, culture of conquering nature. Karl Marx said that the ultimate contradiction between human beings and faces is between human and nature, and therefore we have to conquer it. That's not been our attitude. Our attitude has been that of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and therefore, from very long periods of time, our consumption habits, the way we live, our own, the way we behave, as it were. We are the only people who worship trees, and it's well known, and we worship our birds and so on. So therefore, that tradition gives us the strength, the inherent strength, to become ecologically conscious and environmentally friendly and so on. Now the thing is that this is a case of one more case of reversing the increasing consumerism in our society, which we are imported now in the last few decades. And that can be done, because that doesn't come naturally to us. And I think that should be done, and I see many signs of that happening also. Now that's something that shouldn't be very difficult, because we can pick up our own traditional volumes and knowledge and dig into it and figure out as to how we then come back to, yes, I know our rivers are not clean and our rivers, but nonetheless, all our rivers are named after goddesses. And Brahmaputra, the only one which has got a masculine name, is named after, as the son of Brahma. So we can do it. So that's the second point, that it is in our nature, it is in our tradition, it is in our psyche to be environmentally friendly. The third point I want to make is that I'm so glad that finally, that advanced economies and the people in advanced, developed, rich societies, the OECD economies, have realized that this global public good will be achieved not by mere talk, but by actually action and putting money on the table. And for the first time, I'm told, and I'm very happy about it, that in COP26 in Glasgow, the World Bank has agreed, World Bank along with some other multilaterals, I believe $100 billion fund. And a friend of mine, Ravi Venkatesan, has been appointed as the chairman, and therefore I know about it, to do this and to both, and to more to adapt, because as somebody said, time for mitigation is probably over, and this is now time for reversal. So this is, I think, finally the penny has dropped, but I'm afraid there have been precedents in advanced economies, in the largest economy of the world, who don't believe in that. And I'm scared that the same, that you can get CEOs and national state leaders once more. And I believe there are some stirrings of the opposite sort even in Europe, in some countries where people believe that this is, this is just too much going on, and it costs a lot, etc. I hope that doesn't happen and that there is a consensus in the advanced economy about this. The happy thing is, the good augury is that private sector in the advanced economy has now taken up the running. Google has become carbon neutral in 2007. Netflix has decided to do so by 2022. Facebook and Apple by 2030. And unfortunately, Coke and Nestle by 2050, they could do better than that, I'm sure. But at least now the very big corporations have taken up the running, and this will be hopefully one case where the governments will follow the private sector, and therefore, and that will actually be great. The same thing is beginning to happen in India, and I might as well say that I'm thrilled to know that very large corporations like Reliance, like ITC, like Tata's, like Mahindra's have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Environment and Forests for becoming carbon neutral voluntarily. And Professor Dr. Mashilkar is here, and who knows and he is the chairman of the Joint Energy Council of Reliance, which has announced the 111 program, and which I'm sure will happen because when that sort of a decision is taken, well, let me not go into the details of it, but and this is again a very happy augury that our private sector. But friends, I'm happiest because just yesterday, and believe me, it was just yesterday, a director from NEERI, the National Environment and Energy Research Institute at Nagpur, with the name of Rajesh Beniwal, visited me yesterday. And he was telling me an amazing story that he got a cold call from a small village in Maharashtra. I forget the name and the taluk, from a young farmer who had given up his BTech or something and gone to farming, calling him to say, Mr. Beniwal, can you please tell me how to make my village net zero in 2030? Now that's incredible. And that's what gives me hope. That the amount of awareness, that the amount of sort of propagation, the advocacy that our Prime Minister has done and some others have done in this country, that has become now, it is becoming now far more pervasive than before. And I think that is where I think I notice it even in the urban centers, that circularity is coming back again. The way consume and throw is not looked at with great as a sign of being a big thing, and so on, which unfortunately when I was a young man in college had become the creed that if you waste, then you prove that you are rich. But that's thankfully changing. So therefore, let me start by saying what we in the government and Niti Aayog are doing to seize this challenge and to address this challenge so that we can meet the targets that our Prime Minister has announced in Glasgow and otherwise. First, let me start off where I ended, which is the circular economy. And I think that's key. And Niti Aayog is preparing 11 sector reports, of which 7 have already been prepared in collaboration with all the departments, ministries, stakeholders, outside. And the idea there is that, and this will soon become a cabinet decision as to how in these sectors incentives will be given for people who will take up, who will implement, the circularity in a bigger way. And I think, and here some of it is already happening. I know of a company of young people passing out of Roorkee, which have got, which have already put up a 10,000-ton plant for recycling lithium-ion batteries. And they assure me that, sir, you give us 5 years and you won't need to import lithium any longer. A 10,000 ton, and they are putting a plant, similar plant in a state in the US. I forget the name. I think maybe it's Minnesota. Another two young people, twins, incredible. They're 23-year-old, and they've got many awards, and they've met the president, and these are the Bharadwaj twins who got a 6,000-ton plant in Faridabad and a 5,000-ton plant in Gwalior to recycle electronic waste. and they are going to, and they say that their ROI is 8 months or less, where they will break even from this, because companies like Huawei, because of the rules passed by the MOEF&C, are now having to pay them 15 rupees a kilogram for collecting their electronic waste and recycling it. And amazing combination has come up, where they are now combining with, and they've said me that they've made a partner of the largest kabadi wala in Delhi, to make sure that their supplies come untrammeled. Two Indian from the US Enersol, company have now established the beachhead with the help of and Niti Aayog, I'm proud to say, has played a role in all of this, to convert municipal waste to energy, through a plasma technology, which will raise the temperatures to the extent that it will not leave any residue for again wash. So there is no carbon, emissions out of that, and it's happening. 50 tons per day to be scaled up to 250, and NTPC is backing it. And the chairman of NTPC, therefore, is confident that he will run a hydrogen bus, a fuel cell bus anyway, three months from now, as KPIT has done. But NTPC tells me that they will back, and IOC tells me that they will back these technologies. Again, IOC reminds me that an industry from Pune, Praj, I think, has signed an MOU with IOCs and others to put up plants to convert agricultural residue, in Panipat and other places, to syngas, and hopefully later on even to hydrogen. So that's the circular economy that we've got going in the government and in this country, which gives me optimism. And that I think, should warm the hearts of all your audiences, that India and India's private sector is doing its bit going forward. Second one, and I don't want to go into many details of it, which is the electric mobility, the mission of which is now located in Niti Aayog. And we have done a lot. You all heard of FAME 1 and FAME 2. Several state governments now coming up with the policy that all public buses henceforth will be e-buses, and so on. But the biggest story is that my hunch is, I don't think it's a policy yet, my hunch is that before 2030, you will not get any new IC scooter two-wheeler on the road in this country. It will be over, it's done. And I think, and all the two-wheeler companies have recognized it. And we have now done the work with the Bureau of Indian Standards to standardize battery swapping, operations, which once they become, once that comes into being, all range anxiety for two-wheelers will just disappear. And that will then make two-wheelers, and because these could be sold then without the battery, the total cost of ownership, the TCO, as it says, will become lower than IC scooters within, I think, the next 2 years. And that will then bring about a revolution which will take away the emission full two-wheelers from the roads, and which account for, I think, 67% of transport emissions off the road, and replace them with batteries and so on. And linked to that is the production-linked scheme, incentive scheme of the advanced cell technology, advanced chemistry cell batteries that we've got, which will mean that we will get substitutes, hopefully, for lithium, which is being monopolized by China. But again, companies that I mentioned above will take us off that. Now, the renewable energy, I am sure and I know has been talked about a great deal in this conference. I don't want to go there. All the targets are well known. It's happening. Solar, etc., etc. The breakthrough is going to come by storage battery technology, whereby you can make renewables provide 24/7 energy in a manner which is at the moment not possible, and that will happen sooner than what we think, rather than later. So that's the other one. Friends, the green hydrogen policy was announced on the 17th, a day before, by the Ministry of Power. I hope all of you are very aware by it. The target is 5 million tons of green hydrogen. Please notice green hydrogen, not blue, not gray, green hydrogen to be produced by electrolysis, and therefore using a fair bit of electricity. Some incentives are being given there. Transmission is going to be free. Bunker space is going to be made available for green ammonia near the ports. Interstate transmission will not be charged, and you've got a single porter for all clearances, and you've got, and they will be given preferential connectivity to the grid once they start generating, the electricity from green hydrogen. And again, Niti Aayog has played a significant role in taking this step forward. And quoting the NTPC chairman again, the future of energy in India is solar plus hydrogen. And if you get solar plus hydrogen, ladies and gentlemen, we may not have to bother about the electricity subsidy to anybody at all, because that's probably at that time, it's pretty much, very low cost energy that you've got, and India can become an energy sufficient country before too long, if this breakthrough comes about. And I'm confident that it will come about because of what I've seen being done in private enterprises and in the government labs. I know I'm running out of time, but let me just, because that's my pet, be in the bonnet these days, because I think the largest reversal of carbon from the environment, the biggest carbon sequestration program can be undertaken by pursuing natural farming. And natural farming, which is 100% chemical-free farming, where you don't plunder the land, where you don't put dollops of urea and pesticide and weedicide into it, which drives the carbon out of the land, combined with gobar gas and others, which also reduces the methane from our cattle population and uses it earlier. And the carbon, the natural farming, I know, let me give you just one backup. At independence, our soil had 2.5% of carbon, organic carbon. This is the statistics from the Institute of Soil Sciences in Bhopal. 1.5% is needed to keep the land arable. Today, our average is 0.4%. We have driven our land towards aridity, towards desertification. We've got to reverse it. And in the 11 states where it has been taken up by 300,000 farmers, at least to begin with now, including horticulture and Himachal, etc., scientific evidence collected by agriculture universities show that carbon content in soil has improved from 0.4 to at least 0.7 and 0.8%. And that carbon comes from the environment. And not only that, and therefore that can become this, and I'm glad to say that the German Development Ministry has given, I think, a 30 million euro grant to the Institute of Agroecology in Andhra Pradesh. And I believe that the Bundestag has taken a view that all future development aid will go towards agroecology. And France has announced a similar thing. India has the chance to become a leader here. And this is, to put it in Dr. Mashelke's terms, our big opportunity to pole vault, into because agriculture, if it becomes carbon neutral, it now generates 17% of all the emissions, not only carbon neutral, but reverses the carbon content in the atmosphere. I believe that will be the day that we'll make the biggest breakthrough. One more point about the carbon, about agriculture, natural farming, Prakritik Kheti, as it is mentioned, and now there's going to be a separate program in the Ministry of Agriculture with a dedicated budget for natural farming, is that it increases the green cover on the soil. It minimizes and tries to eliminate the exposure of the soil to the sun. It therefore cools the earth, as it is done by all your agroforestry, etc., etc. And as it does that, and with the higher carbon content, its water absorption capacity increases manifold, and the water used in irrigation is reduced to a fourth or to at least just 30% of what you do with chemicals and weedicide, etc. So the groundwater situation is also handled at the same time. So environmentally, there cannot be anything more powerful on the horizon today than natural farming. So I request all the very eminent guests here here who have got a lot of influence. They are all global influencers, to think about that and to work with us in promoting agroecology, not only in our country, but in other parts. I can go on. In the most arid region of Andhra Pradesh, Rayalaseema, rain-starved, they've now got a pre-monsoon crop because of natural farming, because of they're keeping the green cover, etc., so on. So we can do that. We can reverse the desertification, and we can create, and food security will not be a problem, and because we need to take it up gradually and handhold the farmers as we go along. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, any case, if you're going to be in India, if you're going to be in policy making, you have to be an incorrigible optimist, which is what I am. And I think there are now reasons for my incorrigible optimism, because I think what we are doing and what we propose to do will surely lend a hand to the global community in addressing this challenge and making this global public good come good. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir.
Without wasting time, shall we invite Dr. Mashelkar to give his comments? Dr. Mashelkar?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Our most dear friend, our most beloved Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Dr. Vijay Kedkar, Amitabh Malik, the great EECC team, and ladies and gentlemen. Rajivji, first of all, our grateful thanks. You never said no. I think you and I were on the same platform for Pune Knowledge Cluster just 10 days ago. So your generosity with regard to giving your time to Pune International Center and other activities is tremendous. It's a coincidence that one optimist is following another optimist. People call me Rajivji dangerous optimist, Durdam mein Ashawadi. So I share your enthusiasm. I share your enthusiasm about India. Let us put it this way. I think you described very eloquently the great work that Niti Aayog has been doing, and we are seeing its impact sort of already. Let us understand that India is the most attractive country, the third most attractive country for renewable energy investment and deployment for the world today. Because yes, technology is very important, but policy and investment is very, very important. And we are an attractive investment sort of destination. I want to congratulate Amitabh. Amitabh, the purpose, perseverance, and passion matter, and I've never seen someone other than you having the same level of it. And your terrific EECC group. We had 2 days terrific session. Rajivji, yesterday there was youth. Somebody has said, I only think of the future because that is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. And very frankly, the future belongs to the youth. And you should have heard yesterday their talks in terms of promises to action. They just don't want promises, they want action. And it was absolutely terrific. These 2 days have been absolutely phenomenal in terms of our learning. I want to make, because I have Rajivji also on the list, I want to make sort of a few points. And I not always speak about what I know. I don't speak about what I don't know. And research, technology, and innovation is something that I've spent all my life. So I will talk about that and its importance. Make in India is fine, but it has to be make in India and invent in India. And we have seen the perils of not doing it by just remaining assembled in India. And therefore, I'm very happy, Rajesh, that you talked very passionately about technologies that are coming. I think time is not on our side, and therefore we'll have to have sort of different types of action. I would suggest 5 strategies, basically. The first is, of course, buy. When you have somebody, you have dollars and somebody is prepared to give you technology, you can buy it. That is always not the case, by the way. People don't look at India as a bottomless pit of demand. The second option is make, like invent in India. The third one is buy to make better. The transistor technology was not Japan's, but they got the patents, and then they became the leaders. The other one is made to buy better. I mean, in a sense, once you are higher up on the knowledge curve, you are able to negotiate better. And I've seen in my life how you can get technologies once you are there. And the last and most important and the most preferred one is make it together. Make it together, because we have the academia, the national lab, the startups, private sector industry, public sector industry, how we can work as a team in there. So, Rajiv, because our targets are very tough, we have to choose, create a balance between the two. Let me illustrate that. Let me illustrate. For example, you talked about the lithium challenge. Yes, of course, we can do recycling, and that's a good way of doing it. But how about becoming completely independent of lithium? And because there is cobalt also, there is a cobalt issue. You know, rogue countries are sort of having a control of that. And therefore, the sort of alternative is sodium, which is available in abundance. Now, there is a make or a buy option here. The buy option has been taken up by Reliance. For example, they just acquired a company called Ferrarion, which provides very, very competitive sodium. But that is fine. $135 million they pay. But we are making also, right in Pune, you talked about KPIT. You know, the other great program that they have is sodium, and they are well advanced, as a matter of fact. So it is not make or buy. We have to use all the 5 options to sort of work together. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is about, for example, you talked about fuel cells. Fine. I mean, we had Tata Motors, Indian Oil, the first hydrogen fuel cell they did 3 years ago. But where was the fuel cell from? It was a 70 kW fuel cell that they got from Ballard, as a matter of fact. But you yourself were talking to me on the other day about the admiration for what KPIT has been able to do in terms of India's own, and they would have launched this 32-seat, 9-meter air-conditioned bus with sort of complete powertrain, complete battery power package, complete fuel cell done in India. All right. So that's fine. You import Ballard, but at the same time, you are capable of doing it, basically yourself. So these options, I think we have to look at very carefully. The third one is that, how did that bus come about? It was a public-private partnership. It was the making it together issue. When I was the DG of CSR, I remember I was starting New Millennium Indian Technology Leadership Initiative. And, you know, that has come actually a long way. In 2002, we started, when people hardly talked about sort of green hydrogen, created methanol reforms. 2004, for example, we had the first proton exchange membrane-based sort of fuel cell, and so on and so forth. And that partnership is one which enabled us basically to create this partnership. So among these buy, make to buy better, buy to make better, making it together, we'll have to sort of create these options. And Rajivji, I'm very proud to tell you that entire fuel cell program of CSR with public-private partnership with all the has cost 100 crore. $13 million, that's peanuts. That's why I always say that when it comes to affordable excellence, we are number one. That is why you see those 1,200, 1,300 sort of R&D centers of companies, because we sort of affordable excellence, you know. 1/3 of their IP is getting generated by using Indian IP here. Why can't our industry use our own IP to create our IP like this? Now, Rajiv, here, what is most important, and you talked about policy, that's extremely important. Let me just take one example as an illustration. For example, there are 600,000 towers approximately, all right? And we have today basically indigenous technology developed by National Chemical Laboratory, SICRI, NPL, in partnership with others, which is a proven technology, which can replace those diesel generating sets, basically, all right, on which they operate. I'll just give you some numbers, which are very interesting, that even if 30% of these were replaced by proton exchange membrane fuel cells, which are indigenous, you know what will happen? There are 18,000 systems. And what has happened is that while that program was done, I'm very proud to tell you, we did vendor development. Because one of my own experience was that for one component, you depend upon the rest of the world and you can get screwed up. Like, you know, the SARAS program, I remember 15,000 components and world starting generator, did not have available. It was under sanctions and our project was delayed by 18 months. So I said everything, and under Dr. Ashish Lere's leadership, who is the current director of National Chemical Laboratory, we created that. So there are 18,000 systems which actually can go in this, and 20,000 new jobs can be created. And you know the impact on the carbon, 2.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide can be reduced. NOx 75% reduction, SOx 100% reduction, and particulate matter 80% reduction. So all that the government has to do, like you are talking about the other thing, is to look at such a sector. For example, technology is there. Mix it with a bold policy of this particular kind. Give time targets and it will happen. I think that's what, and that's why I'm emboldened to see the green hydrogen policy, by the way. It has just the right notes. It has just the right sort of tunes, I think. So it is that combination that is. The only other thing that I would like to mention, and I will finish in just a few minutes. I think it is time that we don't become followers, we become leaders. When I said New Millennium Indian Technology Leadership Initiative, I mean being ahead of the rest of them. Yes. Take, for example, green hydrogen. You know, we should put grand challenges to our students, like we did at that time, you know, unreasonable, you have to put unreasonable targets. See, for example, we are talking about green ammonia, right? And we are still depending upon the conventional processes. Why? Have a breakthrough to electrochemical green ammonia synthesis from air and water. You have nitrogen in the air, and water will give you the hydrogen, basically. And as we speak, NCL has started this particular project. Grand challenge, breakthrough. Secondly, third generation electrolyzers. Why worry about first and second generation? And there are ideas on that. Or for example, seawater electrolysis. You know, it's a very interesting idea without generating power. Or photocatalytic water splitting, for example, with 10% efficiency. Or low energy LOSCs with something like 10 kWh per kg. I'm just giving you 5 examples, and none of these targets have been reached anywhere, basically. I think we should inspire our youth by giving such thing, and that will mean risk-taking, because when you do something for the first time, you are bound to fail, and that's what we did in the Neutrality program, as a matter of fact. So I think staying ahead of the competition, creating strong intellectual property, and government has very generously created this National Research Fund now, the big fund. You know, some of that has to be earmarked for such a sort of grand challenges. And the last point I like to make is your favorite point, leapfrogging to pole vaulting, like you said. We have to jump, and we have demonstrated that, isn't it? And of course, Deepak Gupta ji talked about government-driven. Yes, and of course, I mean, you know, we have seen that happen in the light-emitting diodes, as a matter of fact. You know, it is incredible how LED is 150 times demand in sort of 6 years, and you know, from 5 million to 770 million bulbs, how we moved in a quick time. That's the policy. Demand aggregation. All right. In fact, I remember, Rajivji, there is this Queen Elizabeth Prize of Engineering, which is like a Nobel Prize in Engineering, £1 million. And the prize went to LEDs last year. I've been on the jury. And I mentioned to them about what India has been able to do. And I said, you can't have technologies which do not impact sort of development. So we have been able to do things with speed, with scale, with sustainability. I will not give many examples. Yes, they are top level, but they can be also sort of bottom level. There has to be sort of like the wonderful, inspiring story you talked about, that villager who wants to sort of making carbon neutral. And that is why, Amitav, you will remember that 3 years ago, we launched the climate literacy program, basically, because each one of us should know right from the morning when we get up till evening, sort of what we do and what impact sort of it has. And the last point I'd like to make is that there are 3 Ds, Rajivji, which are going to sort of determine our future: digitalization, decentralization, and decarbonization. I think it's extremely clear. And in all these, I can see and decentralization point was touched by Deepak ji also. We are sort of going to be the leader. So one optimist followed another optimist. As I said, I'm dangerously optimistic about India becoming a leader. So thank you, Amitav, for organizing this and getting us all together. There is a new energy in the air, I can see. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasant duty to very quickly summarize all that has happened, and then I'll hand over to Aditi to propose a vote of thanks. Actually, when we discussed about the title of the conference, Decade of Change, India in the Climate Challenge World, we were wondering whether we are being too ambitious. But the past 2 days and the kind of thought exchange that has happened has proved us right that we are indeed in the decade of change, and everybody recognizes it. And of course, we are talking about the India in the climate challenged world. So we're accepting that our world has changed and therefore we must change. Only thing that I feel like saying that the central message that has come out in past 2 days is that the youth is completely energized, youth is very much aware, youth is very much, ambitious about getting their future as good as possible despite whatever has happened in the past. And today we heard our keynote speaker say, there's a tone of the discussion has changed. We are not discussing about what is there and what is not there. We are now discussing about what is to be done and how fast can we do. So this whole purpose of this conference was to bring home the urgency that is required, the priority of the actions that must actually take place. In fact, yesterday, our young Minister Environment he very boldly said that we have to politicize this whole issue of climate change. And I think that's one thing that we are really going to follow through. Dr. Kelkar has advised us to prepare a manifesto for climate change, climate action. We will all do that. So with that, I will say that this has been an absolutely wonderful, knowledge-based discussion, and the organizers have been completely rewarded with huge benefits. So thank you from my side, and let me hand over to Aditi.
Amitabh, before
yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to express my appreciation to you and your group, and also personally thank my colleague Dr. Raju Kumar for his very scintillating and inspiring presentation. Raju, thank you so much. And you have been always very kind to PIC, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Kelkar sir, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, and thank you, Malik sir. We are happy that we got to listen and understand such a vast range of research and environment-economic solutions in just 2 days. I thank Mr. Ravi Pandit, Honorable Minister, Mr. Aditya Thackeray, and Dr. Rajiv Kumar for their insightful and thought-provoking addresses. I also thank our speakers, Dr. Roxy Matthew Kaul, Dr. Priyadarshini Karve, Ms. Archana Soreng, Mr. Yash Agarwal, Mr. Prithviraj Lingayat, Mr. Chandrabhushan, Mr. Siddharth Bhagwat, Dr. Deepa Bhadri Narayan, Dr. Gurudas Nulkar, Mr. Gagan Sithu, Dr. Nitant Mate, Professor Dr. Peter Heck, Mr. Ramesh Venkatraman, and Dr. Deepak Das Gupta for all the wonderful sessions. We thank PIC President Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar, Vice President Dr. Vijay Kelkar, and Director Mr. Abhay Vaidya for all their guidance and support. We thank all the PIC staff for their incessant support and help. We thank everyone who has been directly or indirectly involved in organizing this conference. Our team is grateful to Professor Amitav Malik for giving us this opportunity to be a part of this unique and thought-provoking conference. I especially thank my team members, Siddharth, Riya, Prithviraj, Shalvi, and Gangotri for organizing this conference and the media outreach. And a big thanks to all the audience and participants for joining us for the conference and for the valuable interactions in chats and question and answers. We look forward to see you all for the next conference next year, and let's stay connected for climate action. Thank you. We'll sign off for the day now.
Aditi, can we have
Just before signing off, I request the panelists to please switch on cameras. We'll just take a group photo together.
Aditi, we want to thank you. 2 days, you have done a splendid job. And I hope somebody has told you that you have the most beautiful smile.
Thank you, sir. It was a privilege to interact with all of you.
Right.
Yeah. Let's short.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you.
Utility.
It was a very
It has been a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Yes, it was a very
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kelkar. Thank you, Amitabh.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Namaskar.
Take care. Take care.